Hey folks, tonight we're diving into something a bit grimmer than courtly scandals, medieval drudgery. If you're here for soothing history, hit like and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these midnight tales. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global sleep seekers. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum, and let's ease into tonight's gloomy journey. Let's get one thing straight. History wasn't all nights and feasts. Some jobs were so foul you'd rather lie awake counting sheep. Imagine scrubbing the bloodstains off gallows beams at dawn, wrenching bodies into plague pits by torchlight, or plunging into cesspits to scoop out human waste all before breakfast. These were the essential workers of medieval Europe, forced to confront death, disease, and dung daily. If you think your commute is rough, wait until you hear about the gong farmers who scooped sewage under the moon, or the charcoal burners, whose lungs blackened for a few copper coins tonight. We start with the absolute worst job of all. Would you dare scrub away the marks of justice on the hangman's scaffold? You find yourself at dawn's first light in a nameless medieval town square. The cobblestone slick with dew and livestock droppings. A chill lingers in the air, and torches still gutter at the barracks door, where the day's first detachment of conscripted laborers awaits. They will become the characters in today's lesson in monotony and misery, workers pressed into the worst jobs imaginable in medieval Europe. In these dismal occupations, survival hemmed ever so close to despair. Each day's drudgery carried the faint promise of another broken night's rest, a brief survey of despair before we descend into the specifics. Note that medieval society is structured around feudal bonds and ecclesiastical decree assigned work not by interest or aptitude, but by class, gender, and sheer desperation. The poorest peasants, criminals, orphans, and condemned prisoners formed the labor pool for tasks too dangerous, too filthy, or too psychologically wrenching for others. No guild protected them, no church indulgence granted relief. Their existence was the recoil of history's grand narratives, castles rising, armies mustering, markets expanding, all built upon the back-breaking toil of the anonymous, the gallows cleaners. Scrubbing away justice, one of the most odious roles was that of the gallows cleaner. After public executions hung men, women, sometimes children, their bodies were unceremoniously cut down, tossed into carts, and hauled to mass graves. But before that, detested laborers armed with brooms, buckets of vinegar, water, and coarse hemp cloths were ordered to scrub away the blood, the gore, and the stains of justice. Imagine standing beneath a freshly stained wooden beam, the scalpels and rope marks still visible against splintered oak. Ravens circled overhead, pecking at scraps of flesh. In the flickering torchlight, convicts forced to perform this duty saw their own reflections in pools of coagulating blood. Guards stood close by, jeering at their revulsion, offering no respite. Every scrub and rinse reminded the cleaner of his own precarious place in a world where a single misstep, failure to pay rent, a verbal insult to a magistrate, could consign him to the same scaffold. This task combined physical revulsion with psychological torment. Chroniclers note that some cleaners became desensitized, yet most fled the role in trembling terror, scrubbing hastily, leaving spots untouched, only to face brutal beatings once discovered. Their hands, raw from brine and acid, often developed permanent lesions, and more than a few succumbed to infection in an era before antiseptics. Plague pits, gravediggers, unearthing the dead by twilight during the Black Death waves of the mid-14th century. The weight of death overwhelmed churchyards. Mass graves, often termed plague pits, required unrelenting labor to keep pace with the dead. Gravediggers worked from dawn to dusk and into the night during emergencies, wielding shovels caked with contaminant soils. They labored under edict, ordering bodies to be buried in layers, stacked 6 deep, sprinkled with quicklime to hasten decomposition. Each body, a husband, wife, child, was an anonymous heap to cover and conceal. The lime burned through skin, emitting a sour stench that lingered for months. Many gravediggers wore nothing but tunics and felt hats. Some wrapped rags over their faces, though masks were rare. Survival hinged on a blend of speed and fatalism. Those who slowed to weep at the sight of a familiar face risked a beating or summary dismissal. Some gravediggers chose temporary refuge in monastic cellars, but invariably returned once the cost of absence became starvation. Chronic accounts mentioned bodies unburied, pilling ankle-high, yet gravediggers persisted. Driven by wage promises, meager coins delivered through prison bars, or whips wielded by town councils. Terrified by plague's advance, sewage trough cleaners, dung and disease outside castle walls, cesspits and open sewers ran beneath streets, disgorging human waste and animal offal. Maintenance fell to the ugliest jobs of all. Night soil cart drivers and trench cleaners, sometimes euphemistically called gong farmers. At midnight, after the streets quieted, gong farmers, often convicts, granted temporary reprieve, shouldered heavy buckets or strapped wooden boxes to horses. They descended into pitch-black pits, lifting lids slick with slime, plunging baskets into miasmatic water. The stench was said to induce hallucinations. Few lasted a week before begging for transfer or succumbing to cholera-like diseases. Their carts groaned through narrow lanes, depositing offal at disposal grounds or into rivers when no city ordinances intervened. Laws forbade householders from seeing a gong farmer's face, and many warned children to bolt shutters lest a wandering scoop splash plague-tainted fluid onto clean clothes. Even cats and dogs avoided their path, signaling to superstitious townsfolk that these unfortunates carried a curse as potent as the waste they carted bone. Collectors and charcoal burners haunting the margins beyond immediate filth and death. Other worse jobs thrived on society's fringes. Bone collectors scoured battlefields or butcher yards gathering crushed fragments for fertilizer or glue. Their hands sifted among shattered skulls and rib fragments, searching pockets for coins or religious tokens. Charcoal burners inhabited remote forest clearings, stacking wood in earthen kilns and covering them with turf. They ignited fires that smoldered for days, feeding vents to control burn rates. Their lungs blackened and eyes stung from creosote fumes. Skins blistered where hot coals slapped their limbs. Only the poorest peasants accepted such hazards for a few copper coins per load. The unending echo of drudgery in each of these roles: gallows cleaner, plague, gravedigger, gong farmer, bone collector, charcoal burner. The laborer confronted the grotesque and the grim with mechanical persistence. Their stories seldom reached chronicles, for scribes preferred tales of kings and conquests. Yet without these unremarked souls, medieval society's foundations would have collapsed under blood, disease, and waste. As you trace the spade marks in a plague pit or watch a hooded worker scrub dung-caked beams, consider how thin the line stood between ordinary life and these horrors. You might wonder, what coping strategies did these laborers develop to endure the stench and sorrow? Did some form secret guilds for mutual support, or recite prayers as shields against despair? And when the work finally ended, whether through death, pardon, or escape, how did they reintegrate into a society that feared and spurned them? This grim panorama of medieval drudgery sets the stage for Section 2, where we will delve deeper into the personal stories, coping rituals, and occasional acts of quiet rebellion that sustained these workers through the darkest hours of history. Here in the hushed corridors of history, the greatest horrors often reside not in pitched battles or royal intrigues, but in the mundane drudgery that makes any grand design possible. Tonight, you'll meet the poorest, the most vulnerable souls of medieval Europe, those forced to perform the absolutely worst jobs. They scrabbled in fetid refuse, unearthed plague-mired corpses, and scrubbed away the stains of justice so the world could go on as if nothing had happened. If you think your daily grind is rough, wait until you hear about the gallows cleaners, plague pit gravediggers, cesspit scoopers, bone collectors, and charcoal burners whose stories rarely find their way into song or scripture. 1. The gallows cleaners, scrubbing away justice in nearly every medieval market town. A scaffold stood at its edge, wooden sun-bleached and forever stained. Executions were public rituals of royal power or ecclesiastical discipline, but once the crowds dispersed and the condemned's body was carted off, someone had to make the place presentable again. That someone was the gallows cleaner, often drawn from the ranks of debtors, vagrants, or convicted criminals. These poor souls were ordered at dawn to return to the scaffold, armed with coarse hemp cloths, vinegar water buckets, and a handful of scrubbing brushes. They scrubbed in loops that never seemed to finish. They worked under the jeering eyes of guards who cracked whips to keep them moving and, sometimes cracked, jokes at their expense. Imagine the scene. You stand before a thick wooden beam, rope-burned grooves still evident. Below you, blood-fresh or congealed mottles the platform. You can smell its coppery tents on the breeze. Ravens perch on nearby rooftops, waiting for scraps. You lift your brush, dip it into the vinegar solution, and begin to scrub. The leather of your hands softens and then cracks. By midday, your skin is raw. You stoop and wipe, rinse and scrub, working each plank until it gleams, yet the slightest misstep reveals another crimson smear dot. Sometimes the town crier announced the name of the next victim. The crowd's jeers and gasps lingered in your ears. As you scrubbed, guards mocked your revulsion, daring you to touch fresh blood on the beam. You could not refuse. A single protest earned you a beating or worse, consignment to the very scaffold you cleaned. No guild-protected gallows cleaners, no church offered indulgence. Only the promise of mercy told by a pitiless magistrate kept them alive. When their shift ended, they stumbled away, hollow-eyed, wondering if tomorrow's dawn might instead bring their own summons dot to plague pit. Gravediggers unearthing the dead by twilight when the Black Death swept through Europe. In the mid-14th century, parish graveyards overflowed. Holy ground yielded to necessities, demands, and mass graves. Plague pits multiplied in fields outside city walls. Digging these pits was an urgent, grim task, often assigned to the same desperate classes: runaway serfs, debtors, and criminals. From dawn's first gray light to the deep hours before dawn, gravediggers wielded shovels, their blades slicing through sodden soil. They labored under town council edicts. Bodies were to be stacked, 6 deep, with layers of quicklime between strata to speed decomposition. Each body, stripped of identification, became a nameless lump in the mound. Picture the work, the air, pangs heavy with the stench of decay. Soft earth gives way to clotted remains, stray hands, fragments of garments, scorched pockets once filled with prayer beads. You pitch bodies by the armful, your arms slick with slime. The lime burns your skin, leaving it raw. Each breath stings your throat. You cough amid miasmic clouds that cling to your lungs. You may glimpse a face you once knew, a neighbor, a fellow laborer now sunken and hollow-eyed. There is no time for sorrow. A city guard prods you with the spears, but demanding speed. Keep moving, or no coin for supper, he hisses. So you labor faster, your heart pounding, until the pit is filled and covered. The trench becomes a scar on the earth, one of many, where prayers go unanswered and the dead lie forgotten until their names are reclaimed by history's faint ink. 3. Gong farmers and cesspit scoopers, night soil in the moonlight in towns, lacking basic sanitation, open drains and privy pits sloped beneath streets, running past taverns, bakeries, and inns. These sewers and cesspits needed regular emptying to prevent overflow and noxious epidemics. Gong farmers, so named for the sound of their wooden tubs gong scraping the pit floor, were hired often at night to scoop out human waste and animal offal. Under moonless skies, gong farmers descended into cramped pits, oil lamps dangling from belts. Their faces were hidden behind oil-soaked cloth masks, but the rancid stench clung to every inch of fabric, smoothing dirty boards beneath each footstep. They plunged scoops into the stinking slurry and hauled it up, cursing the weight and the smell. Above ground, a cart waited its dark wheels, stained from previous runs. As the layers of waste piled high, the farmer's boots sloshed and his tunic dripped. Rats scurried along the pit edges. Bold in the darkness, flies buzzed and landed on every exposed bit of flesh, drawn by the promise of nourishment. Breathing became a chore. Each gulp of air tasted of rot. The night soil found its way to fertilizer fields, or worse was, dumped into rivers to float downstream. Traders sometimes argued over the price of waste, measuring calories by weight, but the farmers themselves received only a pittance, enough to buy stale bread or a cup of small beer. Daybreak brought no refuge. They returned home, cleansed only by cold water before bargaining again for the next moonlit shift. 4. Bone collectors, picking through fragments, fields littered with bones, battle sites. Abandoned charnel houses, butcher stalls became hunting grounds for another grim trade. Bone collectors, usually the impoverished or imprisoned, gathered fragments to sell for fertilizer, glue, or bone ash in porcelain making. Their work was slow, methodical, and grim. Armed with small sacks and hand-forged hooks, collectors sifted through dusty soil, scavenging skull fragments, shattered ribs, and vertebrae. Each piece yielded a few coppers when sold at town markets, but the psychological toll was immense. They handled bleached skulls that once housed voices and laughter. A single unearthed tooth carried stories, a rustic laborer's stubborn grin, a child's lost molar. Yet bone collectors saw only commodity. Under flinching sunlight, they worked swiftly, keen to finish before strangers passed by to mark or worse, shoo them away. 5. Charcoal burners, lungs of black smoke deep in royal and noble forests. Charcoal burners carved out clearings, stacked timber into conical kilns, and covered these earthen mounds with turf to smolder. The slow burn, fed by wooden vents and covered holes, could last a week, converting hardwood logs into black charcoal, prized for blacksmithing, cooking, and palace kitchens. Charcoal burners lived in makeshift huts beside the kiln, their lungs hazed by creosote fumes, eyes stung, throats itched. They wore minimal clothing, ruffled tunics, and coarsely patched hose to withstand the heat. Their work was ceaseless, tending vents, dousing flare-ups, mending turf roofs to keep the smoke contained. When the burn ended, they dug out glowing coals with iron hooks, loading piles into sacks. Each sack meant pay, perhaps enough grain for the season, but many burned through pay on medical bills, respiratory ailments that medieval physicians misdiagnosed as smoke fever. Some died coughing, their graves marked only by roadside cairns or forgotten heapstones. These 5 occupations, gallows cleaner, plague pit gravedigger, gong farmer, bone collector, and charcoal burner, share a common thread. They forced vulnerable individuals to confront the vilest byproducts of human life and death. No guild protected them, no church blessed them, yet without them medieval society would have collapsed under its own filth and corpses. How did these laborers survive the daily onslaught on body and soul? Did they develop secret rituals, hushed prayers muttered beneath their breath, keepsakes hidden in loincloths, or talismans worn beneath tunics to ward off despair? And what became of them when their bodies gave out? Were they spared by the gallows, granted paupers' graves, or simply erased from the record? These questions linger like the scent of vinegar water on a gallows beam. When dawn's grey light filters through the soot-blackened rafters of the gallows workshop, you find not despair but grim determination etched on the faces of those compelled to the worst tasks. In Section 1, we met the gallows cleaners, plague pit, gravediggers, gong farmers, bone collectors, and charcoal burners' souls, whose days were defined by death, filth, and smoke. Now in this second chapter, we delve into how these laborers endured the physical horrors, coped with psychological strains, and against all odds found strategies for survival, community, and even fleeting dignity in the medieval underworld of work. 1. Rituals of protection and prayers in the dark. 4. Many condemned to the gallows scaffold, scrubbing away the aftermath of executions, offered no room for proper prayer. Yet gallows cleaners, knowing death's proximity, developed whispered rituals. Before each shift, they might slip a worn prayer scroll into a belt pouch, reciting a plea to Saint Martin, protector of prisoners, or Saint Hubert, intercessor for the damned. One 15th century chronicle tells of Janos, a Hungarian serf, who carried a pebble from his home chapel when forced north to clean execution sites in Prague. Each time he scrubbed fresh blood, he pressed the pebble in his palm, murmuring the Lord's Prayer. The guards, ignorant of its power, left him unmolested, perhaps sensing some sacred hush in his murmurs. In plague pit trenches, gravediggers formed an unspoken brotherhood bound by shared hymns. At dusk, one would begin a low chant, Domine Nos, Libera, and others would join in soft voices, their tones rising and falling like waves in a corpse-filled sea. Though sermons condemned mixing profane death with sacred song, parish priests sometimes turned a blind eye, recognizing that these miners of mortality needed spiritual ballast to keep madness at bay. 2. Small mercies and acts of solidarity. Despite the grim labor, pockets of solidarity emerged. A platoon of plague pit diggers might share rations of black bread and watered ale, each portion divided equally, even when some had families to feed back home. Those who had more coins might slip a halfpenny under another's tunic, a silent promise, we endure together. Gong farmers who navigated the fetid night soil canals sometimes slipped scraps of meat or stale cheese into each other's buckets. Even a small morsel proved a powerful comfort amid the reek of excrement. When one farmer fell ill with dysentery, his comrades smuggled him into a spare hovel, wrapping him in clean sheets and ferrying him to the friary for prayers. In a world that viewed them as outcasts, such kindnesses were radical. Charcoal burners, often deep forests, often built communal huts where they could share warmth and swap stories. After a week of smoldering kilns, they gathered around the last embers to hear the eldest burner recount forest folklore, the shape-shifting fox spirits, the protective dryad mothers, and the hidden oak bests that blessed a kill's first flame. Though these tales carried little weight in grim reality, they reminded burners of a world beyond smoke and ash, of roots and life beneath the charcoal crust. Improvised tools and protective innovations. Physical dangers demanded ingenuity. Gallows cleaners, ever wary of rusty nails and splintered beams, created makeshift brushes from bundles of rushes tied with leather thongs. These rush brooms flexed around rough grain, scraping without splitting hands. For vinegar water solutions that stung open wounds, cleaners soaked coarse woolen rags in cooled brewers, yeast a neutralizing agent before scrubbing. Plague pit gravediggers faced miasmatic plumes with no masks, yet some discovered that placing thick layers of wet clay beneath the chin and over nose and mouth filtered dust and slowed decay's stench. They likely learned this from itinerant tanners, who used similar methods when working animal hides. Though the clay cracked and had to be reapplied daily, it gave tunnels of relief in lungs already strained by weighty mass graves. Gong farmers exposed to poisons, and disease-crafted oil lamps using hollowed reeds dipped in animal fat. These slender torches cast enough light to navigate sewers while minimizing smoke. A clever trade-off between visibility and breathability. Some even wrapped their faces with linen soaked in vinegar and aromatic herbs, rosemary, lavender, and juniper, to mask the foul smell and reduce fly swarms. Such measures often spread by word of mouth among farmers, demonstrating how necessity spurred folk innovations in the medieval workplace. 4. Negotiated privileges and exploitation. Laborers in these demeaning jobs also negotiated small privileges. Gallows cleaners sometimes obtained permission to salvage discarded bits of clothing from executed victims' tattered hoods, shawl scraps which they could resell in rag markets. Such vestments of the vanquished fetched a few coppers, enough to supplement meager wages or secure a meal beyond black bread. A late 14th century municipal ordinance in Geneva stipulated that plague pit gravediggers be granted exemption from certain minor taxes for the duration of their work, while meant as compensation. The exemption also bound laborers to the city during epidemics, an exploitative tactic, ensuring a ready supply of diggers when death surged. Yet gravediggers used the relief to pay debts, secure release for jailed kin, or buy livestock forage, turning punitive decrees into lifelines. Gong farmers occasionally struck informal pacts with tavern keepers. In exchange for discreetly emptying chamber pots into sewers at night, they received free ale before dawn. The head tavern owner's sign, a painted gutter mask, hung at the entry, a silent guarantee that farmers would feed both body and thirst after a shift in the foulest pits. 5. Escapes, absconding, and reinvention, and no amount of coping erased the impulse to flee. Some charcoal burners, after years of lung-scarred drudgery, slipped away at sunrise, trading their smoky tunics for peasant wear and seeking work in less lethal orchards or vineyards. A handful became wine press attendants, learning fermentation. From abbey cellars transforming one bit of fate into another form of communal labor, plague pit diggers, to absconded into rural backwaters, adopting new identities as farmhands. They'd shoulder a hoe rather than a shovel of corpses, coaxing single plants rather than piling bodies. Chroniclers record a few instances where former diggers rose to minor local offices overseeing harvest tides or road maintenance. Their grit and disease resistance to serve public functions no one else sought to get those. Cleaners sometimes used contacts among sympathetic monks to secure sanctuary. They'd feint or feign religious experience before an abbey's porter, invoking right of asylum and shedding charges of vagrancy in exchange for a vow of lay service in gardens or spinning wool under monastic oversight. Although still tough work, these roles spared them the daily horrors of the scaffold. 6 unresolved shadows of survival even as individual laborers found ways to endure or escape. The larger structures remained unchanged. City councils, manorial lords, and guild masters still depended on these unwanted jobs to keep society's wheels turning. The coping strategies, prayers, makeshift tools, illicit privileges, and flight offered momentary respite but rarely true liberation. So you might ask, which coping tactics proved most enduring? Did some laborers form secret fraternities, passing down tool-making recipes, prayer scroll texts, or hidden network routes for escape? And what became of those who stayed on until death claimed them? Were they buried in marked graves by grateful survivors, or consigned anonymously to ossuaries, their stories lost in the echo of shovels and brooms? These questions hover in the pallid dawn light, unresolved as the laborers' own fates. The bell atop the town hall tolls 8 times as you step away from the shadowed workshop, where gallows cleaners scrub the marks of justice, and from the foul trenches where plague pit gravediggers rest bodies into the earth. Behind you lie the cesspits cleared by gong farmers, the bone heaps scavenged by collectors, and the smoldering kilns tended by charcoal burners. Their labors dismissed as lowly or loathsome were in fact vital threads in the tapestry of medieval society, keeping streets passable, markets stocked, palaces fed, and plague held at bay. In this final chapter, we trace these occupations to their outcomes, examine how medieval communities incorporated or discarded these roles over time, and consider the broader lessons of dignity, exploitation, and resilience that their stories impart to us today. 1. The legacy of the gallows cleaners. By the late 15th century, many European towns began regulating executions, more tightly moving gallows outside city centers and introducing ritualized disposal of blood and grime. Specialized vergers in cathedral cities took over the duty of cleansing sacred spaces, adopting some of the methods gallows cleaners had pioneered: vinegar-soaked scrubbing, rush broom tools, and protective clay masks. Yet the gallows cleaner as a class faded only slowly. In smaller villages, unfree peasants continued to shoulder these duties well into the 17th century. Church records hint at occasional petitions. One 1623 petition from Sagomba, England, complains that the village's gallows cleaner had died of infected wounds and no replacement had been provided, leaving the execution scaffold to fester for months. Eventually, municipal councils established stipends to incentivize volunteers, an early acknowledgement that even the lowest tasks must be both honored and compensated. Some former gallows cleaners parlayed their intimate knowledge of scaffold construction into roles as executioners, assistants, hangman's helpers, earning slightly higher wages and modest respect for their expert handling of ropes, beams, and trapdoors. Though still stigmatized, these assistants found a narrow route toward improved station. They were, after all, essential to the smooth administration of justice, to plague pit, gravediggers, and the evolution of mortuary practices, the Black Deaths. Devastation prompted profound shifts in burial protocols. By the 16th century, many towns built expanded cemetery grounds and commissioned permanent morthouses for those too poor or unnamed to merit churchyard graves. Gravedigging gradually became the domain of sextons and specialized parish workers who received municipal wages and sometimes church accommodation. Yet the memory of anonymous trenches endured in aristocratic family vaults that, during epidemics, repurposed crypt spaces for mass burials. Family records from Florence's San Lorenzo Basilica note that when courtiers died of plague in 1630, their bodies were interred side by side in vault recesses, the vault's attendant acting as both gravedigger and custodian. A familial memory. Where village records survive, they show that former plague pit gravediggers sometimes became church wardens or cemetery caretakers, leveraging their labor skills and familiarity with church grounds to secure more stable and less lethal employment. The iron-gray hair of an ex-digger was sometimes considered a mark of spiritual tolerance, having stared so closely at death. They presided over funerals with both technical skill and empathetic solemnity. 3. The fate of gong farmers and the sanitation revolution. Gong farmers' night soil workers charted a winding path through history as urban hygiene became a public concern in the late 18th and 19th centuries. City planners built covered sewers and communal latrines, relegating gong farmers to maintenance roles rather than primary collectors. London's night soil men of the Georgian era gained public contracts, wore official badges, and received municipal oversight, yet they remained socially marginalized. Their work deemed too vile for daytime eyes. By the early 20th century, mechanized sewage systems and flush toilets rendered their labor largely obsolete in Western Europe. Some former gong farmers transitioned to roles as sanitation engineers, leveraging their intimate knowledge of plumbing, drains, and waste flow to maintain early sewage treatment plants. In Paris, the 1905 municipal bulletin lauded ex-gong farmers for their contribution to designing an efficient network of interceptor sewer structures that still bear the structural imprints of those who once lugged buckets beneath cobblestones. In regions where flush systems arrived later, or not at all, gong farmers and their descendants continue to fulfill essential sanitation functions, forming municipal corps or private cooperatives. Their collective memory, shaped by centuries of night soil labor, informs participatory sanitation planning in developing contexts today. For bone collectors, charcoal burners, and the rise of specialized trades, bone collectors, once outcasts, scouring battlefields and charnel houses, evolved into specialized craftspeople by the 18th century. In England, marrowbone preparation spawned industries producing bone char for sugar refining and bone china porcelain. Former bone collectors' descendants became skilled degreasers and kill operators in Staffordshire potteries. Their ancestors' grisly work reframed as an early industrial art. Charcoal burners' twilight trade likewise found new life. Their methods of controlling smoldering kilns informed early industrial carbon production, used in metal smelting, gunpowder manufacture, and later gas-activated filters. In Germany's Ruhr region, traditional charcoal burners partnered with industrial ironworks, sharing secret techniques for kiln airflow that improved furnace efficiency. Though the romanticized figures of forest charcoal men survived in folk songs, their toil became central to the birth of modern metallurgy and energy production. 5. Broader impacts, labor hierarchies, and social transformation. These grim occupations reveal foundational truths about medieval and early modern societies. Visibility versus invisibility. Essential labor often resides beyond the public gaze, performed by the most marginalized. Only when technology advanced did these roles gain formal recognition or transformation into respected trades. Adaptation through crisis epidemics, urbanization, and industrialization each precipitated new frameworks for sanitation, burial, and material production, yet each crisis also relied upon the skills honed by earlier, more perilous laborers. Stigma and redemption. The social stigma that cloaked these jobs could be mitigated, though rarely erased, by specialized knowledge and emergent technologies. Those who mastered lethal or filthy crafts sometimes unlocked niches of expertise that outlived the drudgery of their forebears. 6. Reflections on modern resonances. As you lay your head to rest after this nocturnal excavation of medieval misery, consider the echoes in our own era. Sanitation workers overcoming stigma to operate complex treatment plants, mortuary technicians balancing respect for the dead with industrial-scale cremation, environmental engineers using charcoal-derived activated carbon for water purification. Each modern counterpart stands on the shoulders of the gallows cleaner, the plague gravedigger, the gong farmer, the bone collector, and the charcoal burner. Their stories remind us that dignity can exist even in the most unlovely tasks, and that resilience often blooms amid filth and danger. They invite us to honor the invisible labor sustaining our comfortable lives, workers whose contributions, though out of sight, remain the bedrock of public health, hygiene, and societal continuity. And so we close the ledger on these absolute worst jobs in medieval history, each one a testament to human endurance in the face of the grotesque. May your dreams tonight be gentler than the world these laborers endured, yet inspired by their stubborn will to survive. Plague spotters and night watchers, guardians of the Black Death, you step through the silent streets of a medieval town at dusk, long after the marketplace has shuttered and the last lantern's flicker has died. A chill wind rustles through empty windows, carrying the scent of damp straw and distant decay. Somewhere beyond the city walls, carts rumble over cobblestones, hauling the dead to mass gravesand in the darkened alleyways. Figures in oilcloth cloaks and wide-brimmed hats move like phantoms, carrying lanterns or simple flags. These are the plague spotters and night watchers, unsung sentinels of the Black Death, whose grim vigil underpinned every shuttered door and every whispered prayer for survival. Tonight, you will follow their first patrol, the duties they performed, the knowledge they accumulated, and the burdens they bore as guardians of a city teetering on the brink of collapse. 1. Origins of the Watch. From local militia to health patrols long before the plague's first wave in 1347, towns maintained night watches to deter thieves and vandals. Community burgesses and sworn militia members took turns patrolling the streets, calling the hours and raising the alarm at any sign of trouble. But when the Black Death arrived, reaching Europe via Genoese ships and spreading inland along trade, routes authorities repurposed these watches into rudimentary health brigades. In February 1348, municipal councils in Venice and Mars issued edicts empowering plague spotters to record sickness reports and enforce quarantine measures. By spring, similar ordinances appeared in towns across southern France, northern Italy, and eventually the Rhineland in England. The watchmen now carried not only clubs but also notebooks of parchment, quills dipped in vinegar-soaked ink, and simple public health leaflets warning neighbors to isolate the ill. These new duties were unpopular. Many night watchers deserted their posts, unwilling to risk contagion. In response, councils offered extra wages and additional denarius per night and exemptions from certain feudal duties, on paper at least. Still, towns struggled to fill quotas, often turning to unfree peasants or condemned criminals, thus weaving plague vigilance into the fabric of social coercion. 2. Tools of the trade. Lanterns, flags, and logbooks. A plague watchman's kit was austere but crucial. By lantern light, he scanned narrow lanes and courtyard gateways, seeking to signs that could mean doom. The yellow house. Neighbors marked infected homes by hanging a yellow cloth or painting a sun-shaped emblem by the door. Spotters noted these markings in logbooks, ensuring that food deliverers and clergy knew which doors to avoid. The scream or the cough. Infected victims often cried out in delirium or coughed so violently their sputum flecked walls. Night watchers recorded times and locations, allowing magistrates to cordon off entire streets when clusters emerged. Each watchman carried 2 flags, one white signifying all is well, and one black signifying infection present. At each intersection, a quietly raised black flag warned late returning neighbors to detour or risk forced quarantine. Neighbors in good health leaned white flags from windowsills to signal they could share news or accept food drops without fear. Logbook small pallet codices grew heavy with entries. Names, ages, occupation if known, and date of first symptoms were painstakingly recorded. These registers formed the earliest case counts, allowing rudimentary mapping of plague spread. Spotters sometimes compared entries with parish death registers, seeking patterns that might reveal whether houses with poultry at heart of a lane saw faster transmission, or if compact alleyways proved deadlier than open courtyards. 3. The human cost, fear, fatigue, and fractured trust. Despite modest pay, night watchers endured social stigma. Families of watchmen were often shunned. Children of plague watchers found themselves barred from apprenticeships or guilds, deemed likely carriers of contagion. Some wives barred husbands from returning home after shifts, forcing them to sleep in guard towers or behind market stalls, beneath ragged blankets. The emotional toll was heavy. Watchmen witnessed neighbors dragged from beds, heard the last laments of dying friends, and sometimes tasted desperation in the evening air wind. Famished families pounded on doors begging for bread, or bell ringers tolled death knells hour after hour. Fatigue set in, eyes dimmed, hands shook while penning entries, feet ached from patrolling slick stones. Moreover, trust eroded between citizen and sentinel. Some citizens bribed spotters to conceal yellow flag warnings at family homes. Others set traps masking signs of illness to procure stored grain or medical herbs. Corruption and concealment complicated casebooks, forcing watch captains to double patrol certain neighborhoods, risking their lives for the fragile promise of public safety. 4. Strategies of resilience, camaraderie, and coping in response to terror and isolation. Watchmen formed tight-knit brotherhoods after their nocturnal rounds. They gathered in hidden taverns or atop bell towers, sharing lukewarm broth and scraps of bread. There they traded news, which house displayed a second flag, which street had seen fewer bells toll, and which apothecary still offered dried herbs. They developed coping rituals before each shift. They might dip cloths in disinfectant distilled from wine-pressed byproducts and wrap their faces. Some whispered psalms, invoking Saint Sebastian, plague's patron, for protection. Others carried small token spine cones, garlic braids, or sprigs of rue tucked in leather pouches, believing in the warding power of folk superstitions. These nightly assemblies bolstered morale and created informal information networks. When a spotter fell ill, comrades delivered messages to his widow. When a fellow guard succumbed, they repurposed his empty lantern to light their own path. An act of symbolic continuity in the face of relentless loss. An unresolved vigil as dawn's first gray light seeps over shuttered rooftops. The plague. Spotters and night watchers return to their lodging sieve. They have any and hand over logbooks to city clerks. Their entries will guide quarantine zones, food drop routes, and, grimly, the location of fresh mass graves. Then, they sleep fitfully, haunted by coughs in the quiet and the knowledge that nightfall will demand their presence once more. So you may ask, how effective were these early public health patrols in slowing the spread of the Black Death? Did patterns in their logbooks ever prompt changes in urban planning, like widening alleyways or relocating butcher stalls? And in towns that maintained plague watches through later epidemics, what institutional legacies did these nocturnal guardians leave for modern health systems? When dusk falls and the last candles gutter in courtyard windows, plague spotters and night watchers brace themselves for another night of silent vigilance. Their logbooks, now brimming with yellow-flagged houses and hastily scrawled names, guide them into ever more perilous assignments. In this chapter, you will walk beside these guardians as they refine their methods, confront internal dissent, and pioneer primitive but crucial public health measures that would echo into later centuries. 1. Mapping the invisible enemy. By late spring of 1348, watch captains noted that infections clustered not only by neighborhood but around particular urban features, narrow alleys, shared staircases, and unregulated slaughterhouses. Using multiple spotters, they began creating crude plague maps. Intersect counts. 2 spotters at adjoining street corners recorded flag counts and bell tolls hourly. When both reported spikes in yellow flags and funeral bells, magistrates placed that junction under double watch, restricting passage and sealing adjacent lanes with hastily erected timber barriers. Spatial notations. Spotters annotated landmarks, public laundries, market stalls selling fresh fish, public wells, and parchment charts. They noticed that areas downwind of tanneries saw higher infection rates, suggesting a link between foul air and disease risk, though they lacked the term miasma. Data sharing. Captains convened each dawn to compare observations. They banged together empty tin cups and audible signal to summoners passing by and exchanged logbook extracts, pooling intelligence to allocate scarce resources, apothecarial vinegar, linen cloths for lining houses, and even grain loaves. For quarantined families, these emergent mapping efforts represented an early recognition. Plague did not strike at random. Though their causal theories remained rooted in astrological and humoral ideas, the spotters' maps introduced data-driven responses, bolstering patrols where needed most and guiding nascent cordons sanitaire regulations that cordoned off entire districts to stem contagion. 2. The cordons walls of cloth and authority. Having identified high-risk zones, magistrates empowered watchmen to enforce cordons barriers that restricted movement in and out of marked quarters. Constructed from linen canvas hung between posts, these cloth walls fluttered in street winds, an eerie curtain against dusty buildings. Entry permits. Only those bearing official parchment passes, often signed by the mayor or chief physician, cross cordons. Watchers checked passes at lanternlit stations, stamping them with vinegar ink seals. Unauthorized persons faced summary detention in makeshift jails or forced quarantine camps. Food drop points within cordon sectors. Residents pinned notes to cordon poles requesting bread, porridge, or water. Spotters coordinated daily drop-offs. Porters placed supplies on benches just inside the linen barrier, then retreated to safe distance. Families retrieved provisions with long hooks, minimizing direct contact. Enforcement challenges. Wealthy families sometimes bribed watchers, slipping coins through slats in the linen wall for clandestine comings and goings. Others cut holes in walls, only to be chased down by spotters' staves. As breaches became frequent, spotter captains petitioned for armed guards at main gates, escalating plague management from civic duty to paramilitary operation. These cloth cordons, while far from airtight, offered psychological reassurance. A physical barrier signaled that authorities cared enough to intervene. They also served as warnings. Black flags and antiseptic vinegar sprayers at gate posts reminded all comers of the threat they faced beyond the linen wall. 3. Inventing quarantine. Stations and pest houses, the memory of overcrowded plague pits, and anonymous mass graves spurred authorities to create rudimentary pest houses, designated yards or small buildings where the sick could isolate with minimal contact. Watch captains oversaw admissions and discharges, using their logbooks to decide eligibility. Facilities. Pest houses were often repurposed, abbey guest houses or leper hospitals. Beds. Simple pallets of straw lay in rows 6 feet apart, if space allowed. A well-ventilated corridor separated mildly ill from the gravely stricken. Watchers patrolled inside, distributing herbal broths and tart sourdough bread. Staffing, alongside spotters. Certain religious orders volunteered to serve as nurses, reciting prayers while stripping linens or cleaning chamber pots. In return, watchmen ensured friars could leave at dawn safely, in uneasy alliance of piety and public duty. Release. Criteria. A patient required to successive days without fever or coughing before release, a rule adopted from seafaring quarantine. Practices. Watchers recorded symptom decline in personal logbooks, stamping permits of release with the sign of St. Roch, patron of plague victims. These early quarantine stations foreshadowed later pest houses and lazarettes. Though plagued by inadequate supplies and occasional escapes, they demonstrated that collective isolation, coupled with data tracking by watchmen, could slow and sometimes halt local outbreaks. 4. Internal strife, spotter mutinies, and citizen resistance. Not all inhabitants welcomed these measures. As spotters wielded increasing power, brutality crept in. Mutinies in several Rhineland towns. Spotters refused orders to enforce cordons, dreading retribution from enraged residents. Captains quelled mutinies with whipcord lashes, but mistrust lingered. some captains considered arming loyal retinues, fracturing the civic militia into plague enforcers and traditional guards. Resistance movements, guildmasters and merchant councils pushed back, arguing that cordons stifled commerce. In Florence, wealthy merchants bribed spotters to declare their warehouses yellow flag free, allowing goods and money to move despite official bans. The resulting clandestine trade undermined public health efforts, forcing spotter captains to confiscate cargoes, a move that fueled popular outrage. These tensions highlighted a fundamental conflict: the needs of public safety versus economic survival. Watchers, stretched between enforcing lifeline quarantines and placating disgruntled elites, navigated treacherous moral terrain, aware that a single mistaken release or cruel beating could ignite open rebellion. 5. Learning from mortality. Practical innovations. Despite strife, watchmen pioneered several effective practices. Herbal air sanitizers inspired by plague doctors, flower-strewn masks. Spotters hung pouches of rosemary, lavender, and dried angelica at cordon gates and pest house entrances, both to reassure passers-by and to mask fetid odors. Though unaware of germ theory, they noted fewer fatal cases among watchers perched beside fragrant bundles. Linen mask. Trials in 1350. A captain in Languedoc mandated linen cloths soaked in vinegar and submerged in rosemary oil to be worn over nose and mouth. These simple masks, light, washable, and scented, became standard kit for spotters, reducing cough spread among their own ranks. Night shift rotations. Early on, spotter captains noticed fatigue, increased errors, missed yellow flags, or botched log entries. They instituted shifts: 2 nights on duty, 2 nights off. This rotation improved vigilance and lowered infection rates among the watch corps. Such modest adaptations: herbal bags, linen masks, shift schedules from trial and error learning. They also underscored the watchman's role as both enforcers and practitioners of emergent public health, bridging civic authority and medical care long before formal health ministries existed. 6. An unresolved guard of shadows. As the sun climbs over burial mounds and plague-marked houses, you see spotters handing over tattered cordon flags and stained logbooks to daytime clerks. Their nighttime patrols have data, strategies, and small comforts to show for their courage, but questions remain. Which of these early practices, plague mapping, cordons, pest houses, herbal air sanitizers, proved most influential in reducing mortality, and which were mere theater of authority? How did Sparta-initiated quarantine stations evolve into the regulated lazarettos of Renaissance Italy and early modern Europe? And what lessons can our own public health systems draw from these medieval experiments with their mix of compassion, coercion, and improvisation? As the autumn of 1348 deepened into winter, the night watchers and plague spotters faced their greatest trials: dwindling numbers, waning public compliance, and the slow realization that the Black Death had become a grim fixture rather than a passing terror. In this final chapter, we trace how these early public health guardians adapted or faltered as the pandemic's first wave receded, examine the institutional legacies they left behind, and explore how their innovations resonate in modern epidemic response. Attrition, burnout, and the watch corps' decline. By the end of the year, councils in major cities noted that fully 1/3 of their original plague watch corps were dead, ill, or had deserted. The combination of relentless night patrols, direct exposure to contagion, and social ostracism proved unsustainable. Waning numbers. In a surviving payroll list from Toulouse, only 60 of 180 appointed spotters collected wages in December, 1,348. The rest had perished or fled. As vacant posts multiplied, remaining watchers endured double shifts, further increasing fatigue and errors, disintegrating morale. Chronicler Jean de Belfort records that by November, some spotters openly refused to enforce new cordons, accusing councils of using plague measures to seize properties or extract fines. Frustrations boiled over when a guard captain arrested a wealthy merchant for smuggling grain into a quarantine district, leading to an attempted mob rescue and the death of 3 spotters. Temporary truces to regain control. Councils negotiated with merchant guilds, lifting certain cordons in exchange for merchant-provided food convoys and voluntary spotter recruits. These truces stabilized city functions but diluted watch efficacy, as economic imperatives trumped strict quarantine. With each compromise, plague resumed its spread, only more diffusely, demonstrating the delicate balance between enforcement and community cooperation. 2. Institutionalization of health surveillance. Despite setbacks, the networks and methods developed by spotters crystallized into enduring institutions. Office of the Bando Sanitario in 1351. Venice formalized its plague patrols into the Bando Sanitario health mandate, employing salaried capi del malplague chiefs to oversee spotters, enforce quarantines at the Lazzaretti Islands, and maintain detailed health registers. This office became Europe's first permanent public health authority. Routiers de Santé in France, Paris, and Lyon followed suit, appointing routiers de Santé health route keepers to inspect incoming caravans, supervise local spotters, and update plague maps kept in town halls. These officials used spotters' logbook data to calculate travel restrictions and to decide when to reopen city gates. Charter for Medical Oversight, the Council of Basel 1431-49, issued decrees encouraging all cities to create health councils, drawing on plague watch models. While enforcement varied, the principle of state-sanctioned disease surveillance gained traction across Christendom. These developments marked a departure from ad hoc crisis response to systematic public health governance and evolution, rooted in the spotters' nightly patrols and data-driven mapping 3 evolution of quarantine and isolation practices. Cordons of cloth gave way to more permanent infrastructure lazarettos and pest houses. Cities established permanent lazarettos, segregated hospitals on river islands, standardizing patient care and limiting citywide spread. The Venetian model of isolated treatment centers directly echoed the spotters' makeshift pest houses. Maritime quarantine. The term quarantina 40 days entered European lexicon, prescribing ship arrival holds based on spotters' early observations of incubation periods. Ports like Dubrovnik mandated quarantinario for vessels, a policy that proved crucial in later plague outbreaks. Contact tracing. Prefigured logbook practices of noting neighbors and householders presaged contact tracing. In 15th century Ferrara, health magistrates used spotters' registers to summon potentially exposed individuals. Many public health manuals attribute this tracing to innovations by earlier plague watch captains. Thus, the basic elements of modern epidemic control, surveillance, data mapping, cordons, isolation, and tracing coalesced from the spotters' urgent experiments in darkness. 4. Cultural and literary legacies beyond bureaucracies. Plague spotters left cultural imprints, art and literature. The widespread image of a hooded figure with lantern and staff appears in 15th century Italian frescoes, symbolizing both fear and hope. Chaucer's Franklin's Tale alludes to men who guarded doors against the pestilence, a likely reference to plague night watches. Proverbs and folk memory. Phrases like yellow flag at the door entered folk speech as a warning of trouble ahead. In rural England, children repeated nursery rhymes about lantern bearers who chased the Black Death, a distorted memory of spotters. Solemn rounds. Festivals of remembrance. Some Italian cities established annual commemoration of hooded lantern bearers carrying white flags to honor those who died on the plague watch. Blending piety with civic gratitude, these cultural artifacts ensured that spotters' deeds, though anonymous, resounded in collective memory long after the disease waned. 5. Modern resonances. From SARS to COVID-19. When SARS emerged in 2003, Hong Kong officials reenacted cordon sanitaire tactics containing apartment blocks, drawing parallels to medieval linen walls. Likewise, during COVID-19, nations reinvigorated contact tracing, digital mapping of infection clusters, and targeted lockdown strategies, first prototyped by plague spotters 7 centuries earlier. Digital logbooks. Today's case tracking apps echo spotters' parchment registers, recording date, time, and location of each positive test. Flag-based alerts, neighborhood alert systems, QR codes, signaling exposure, risk mirror. Yellow flags once hung from medieval doorways. Night shift. Traces in large cities. Specialized outbreak control teams patrol at off hours, ensuring compliance with restrictions, and nod to the nocturnal vigilance of earlier health guardians. These continuities underscore that while pathogens evolve, the fundamentals of surveillance, isolation, and community cooperation remain constant. 6. Thought-provoking reflection. As you extinguish your bedside lantern tonight, consider the invisible line connecting you to those medieval watchers, a shared burden of vigilance, a debt to those who patrolled cobblestones under plagued skies, and a reminder that public health sacrifices often occur in the silent hours, their courage standing between the living and the unseen scourge laid foundations for the organized epidemic responses we depend on today. May their silent rounds inspire respect for modern health workers, contact tracers, and community volunteers who, like plague spotters, labor in the unseen spaces between health and hazard, ensuring that we sleep through the night in safety. In the stillness of night, when the cobbled lanes of a medieval English town settled into darkness and dogs no longer barked at passing figures, a man shouldered a long pole, a crude lantern swinging at his hip, and descended into a realm most avoided. This was the work of a gong farmer, a title steeped in euphemism but burdened with the foulest duty imaginable, clearing human waste from the latrines and privies of the burgeoning towns of 14th and 15th century England. You likely haven't heard his name. You may have never considered how, in a time without modern sewage, waste vanished from view. But for every noble banquet and alehouse revelry, someone had to bear the physical aftermath. The word gong derived from the Old English, gang meaning to go, specifically to go to the toilet. Thus, a gong farmer was quite literally a waste-goer. His task was both necessary and loathed. Without him, disease would spread faster, cesspits would overflow, and the stench of urban life would intensify beyond bearing. And so, under cover of darkness, when city gates were locked and streets cleared of civilians, he worked. Gong farmers were generally employed by towns or wealthier individuals with private latrines. The job required strength often described in tax records as laborers, but more importantly, it demanded endurance of both physical filth and social exclusion. The work was done with spades, buckets, and eventually wheelbarrows. The most common tool was a long-handled scoop or bucket affixed to a pole. For deeper pits, ladders were lowered and the men would descend into choking darkness, scraping away the layers of compacted excrement, urine, animal waste, rotten food, and bathwater runoff. Protective clothing was rudimentary. At best, layers of wool and leather covered the body. Gloves, if worn, were made of thick cloth. Masks were non-existent. The stench clung to their skin and hair, and no amount of lye soap expensive at the time could fully cleanse the smell. Their homes were often situated at the edge of towns, and their contact with others limited. They were not outlaws exactly, but treated with the same wide berth. And yet, this miserable role came with a few surprising advantages. Gong farmers were paid better than many other laborers, sometimes 2 to 3 times what a field worker might earn. Cities understood the necessity of the work. A clogged cesspit near a market or monastery could bring catastrophe. The workers were also legally permitted to collect and sell night soil. Yes, that's what it was called to farmers as fertilizer. This secondary trade brought even more income. Still, even money couldn't remove the social stain. Gong farmers were commonly prohibited from appearing in public during daytime hours. In many towns such as York and London, municipal codes mandated that they work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. Not only was this to spare townsfolk the odor, but also to protect the workers from harassment. Because they traveled by night, Gong farmers became intimately familiar with the labyrinthine backstreets of medieval cities. Some historical records describe them as walking encyclopedias of alleyways, cellars, and drainage outlets. They knew which taverns had the worst pits, which monasteries secretly dumped waste into rivers, and which corners could hide the tools of their trade. There was, however, a darker reality beneath the foul-smelling surface, one involving real danger. Some cesspits were unstable. The combination of decomposing waste and poor ventilation meant the release of methane and other noxious gases. There are records of workers collapsing from fumes and even, in rare cases, explosions when lanterns ignited trapped gas. Wooden supports might rot, and walls would collapse. In one notable 15th century case in Oxfordshire, a Gong farmer drowned in a collapsed cesspit, his body not recovered until morning. The mortality rate for these workers was high, not necessarily from instant death, but from the long-term effects of repeated exposure. Respiratory illnesses, skin infections, and gastrointestinal diseases were constant companions. Many did not live past their 40s, but who were these men? Records are sparse, but surviving tax rolls, coroner reports, and church ledgers provide a glimpse. Many were former soldiers or debtors. A few were born into the trade, sons of Gong farmers, apprenticed by necessity. Some were even immigrants, drawn to English towns where the demand for such labor was great and the social stigma, while severe was familiar. In London, particularly in the suburb of Farringdon, without Gong farmers became something of a tight-knit guild. They passed down knowledge, tools, and roots from one generation to the next. Apprenticeship was informal but expected. A newcomer was shown the ropes, literally, the ropes by which one lowered himself into pits and taught to identify the telltale signs of gas or rot. They also shared coded language. Red rot referred to dangerous methane buildup. Hard crown meant a cesspit whose upper layers had hardened, masking liquid beneath. And a drummer's gate referred to a privy with a loose floor liable to collapse with any weight. Even as sanitation slowly improved and cesspits gave way to sewers, the legacy of the Gong farmer lingered. Some towns issued special seals to their most reliable workers, bearing symbols of buckets or shovels. These tokens permitted them access to restricted areas, a kind of medieval badge of grim honor. Despite the filth and the danger, a few found pride in the work. There are records of disputes between farmers over territories, and even poems scrawled in the margins of waste-hauling receipts. In one such note from 1498, a farmer in Norwich wrote, "We go where none will tread, with bucket, hook, and dread. They sleep while we descend, to clean what they expend." Poetic perhaps, but also telling of how such men saw themselves not just as cleaners, but as unacknowledged stewards of the town's health. As the centuries turned and sanitation evolved, the Gong farmer faded from view. Yet, in the labyrinthine roots of your modern plumbing, there lies a faint echo of his labor. Each flush, each quiet hum of sewage leaving your home, rests upon the history of men who once scraped and hauled the waste by hand. But what became of these men when sanitation became mechanized? Did their roles simply vanish, or were they reshaped into something equally thankless, hidden behind yet another veil of societal necessity? From cesspits to sewers, a trade transformed. The turn of the 16th century did not immediately spell the end for the Gong farmer. Far from it. Even as cities grew, waste continued to accumulate faster than infrastructure could accommodate. The gong farmer, bucket in hand and shovel over shoulder, remained a crucial, if invisible, presence in the urban ecosystem. But subtle changes were on the horizon, ones that would slowly, decade by decade, alter not only how waste was managed but who managed it. It's tempting to believe that the invention of the flush toilet was an immediate revolution. In truth, its early iterations in the late 1500s were more novelty than utility. Sir John Harrington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, famously created a flushing water closet in 1596. It impressed guests but failed to gain traction. The pipes leaked, water supply was inconsistent, and besides, waste still had to go somewhere. Into the Thames, into a garden pit, a bucket, perhaps. So, the gong farmer remained. By the 1600s, the role began to evolve, not disappear, but diversify. In larger towns like London, Bristol, and York, municipal authorities began formalizing waste contracts. Some gong farmers were appointed to fixed routes, others competed for parish-wide contracts to clean all privies within a given district. They bid on these contracts, sometimes undercutting rivals for the chance to maintain a dozen cesspits over the course of a month. And with formalization came record-keeping. One particularly dry but revealing archive from Southwark in 1633 lists the specific dates of cesspit emptying, weight of extracted waste, and method of disposal. Gong farmers were expected to transport waste out of the city and dump it at designated lacetals, open fields outside town walls. Failure to do so could result in fines, or worse, revocation of their work permit. Transporting waste became a challenge of its own. Buckets and barrows gave way to carts lined with wood and leather, sometimes covered with canvas to suppress the smell. Teams of men would load the carts at night and haul them through back alleys to city gates, where tollkeepers were instructed to let them pass without delay. In some cities, these carts were humorously nicknamed honey wagons, a bitter irony, not lost on those doing the hauling. But the question arises, if waste was being moved to the city outskirts, what happened next? That's where another group emerged, the night soil men, an evolution, in some respects, of the gong farmer. While many gong farmers focused on removing filth from pits, the night soil men specialized in transporting it across longer distances, often by boat, to farms outside the city where it was sold as fertilizer. Their work created a secondary economy. Wealthy farmers purchased treated soil to enrich fields, particularly near river valleys with soft, icily leached soil. Some records show price differences between fresh night soil and aged or dried varieties. The most prized manure was well rotted and free of contaminants, like straw or bones. There was even trade in city muck, a mixture of waste and ashes, valued for its balanced composition. The right ratio of human excrement to fireplace ash could dramatically improve soil quality. It became common to blend ashes from public hearths into carts of night soil before shipment. This innovation increased demand and, in turn, profits for those in the business of waste. With profits came disputes. In 1652, a court record from Westminster describes a violent altercation between two rival night soil crews over access to a particular lane, leading to a well-paying manor house. Fists were thrown, buckets overturned. One man was allegedly struck with a shovel. The court fined both parties but allowed the winning crew to retain the contract. These were not minor squabbles. Waste was money, and access to cesspits became a guarded privilege. By the 18th century, gangs formed in some cities to monopolize the industry. They weren't organized crime in the modern sense, but they did control territory, tools, and even apprenticeship pathways. And yet, with all this structure, the health hazards remained severe. Exposure to waste, year after year, left many workers with chronic ailments. Cesspit lung was a term sometimes used, referring to the persistent coughs and wheezing among veteran workers. Skin conditions were common, including rashes that never quite healed. Some wore improvised scarves soaked in vinegar, believing the acidity protected against infection. Others chewed cloves or garlic, folk remedies against miasmas or bad air, which was believed to cause disease. Despite their risks, gong farmers and their successors often found themselves at the center of larger public health efforts. During plague years, such as the outbreak in London in 1665, waste workers were among the few allowed to move freely during lockdown. Their work was considered essential. Some were even paid bonuses to ensure they continued hauling waste from infected homes. Ironically, this made them more susceptible to exposure. A diary entry from a parish clerk in Clockenwell reads, "The gongers do pass unmolested, and with scarves wrapped across their faces. Many die out of the fortnight, but they be paid well, and none else dare the work." Some took pride in their stoicism. They saw themselves as part of an invisible army, holding back chaos with shovels and wheels. In pamphlets from the mid-1700s, reformers advocating for modern sewage systems occasionally acknowledged these men not with praise, but with curiosity. How could someone endure this work and for how long? The question found an answer in the Industrial Revolution by the early 1800s. With population density exploding and disease outbreaks rising, a new theory of disease germ theory began to take root. Filth was no longer just a nuisance. It was understood, albeit slowly, as a potential vector of infection. Engineers began to propose permanent underground sewer systems. Chief among them was Joseph Bazalgette, the civil engineer responsible for London's revolutionary sewer network. Starting in the 1850s, Bazalgette's efforts would, over several decades, shift the city from manual waste removal to a centralized sewage system, though it would not be fully operational until the 1870s. The implications were clear. The era of the gong farmer was drawing to a close. Still, the transition was gradual. Many homes were not immediately connected to the new systems. Privets still existed. Manual workers remained necessary. In the overlapping decades, old and new systems coexisted. Men still hauled night soil from unconnected homes. The carts still rolled through back alleys. By the late 19th century, the last of the traditional gong farmers, now rebranded as wastemen or sanitation laborers, were absorbed into municipal departments. They wore uniforms, received pensions, and no longer worked solely at night. The trade had become bureaucracy. But for centuries prior, the gong farmer had served a vital and thankless role, safeguarding cities from their own excess. Without their labor, filth would have buried the streets, seeped into wells, and turned urban life into a nightmare of disease and decay. And yet one question lingers as the sanitation revolution swept through Europe and America. What happened to the knowledge these men had? The tricks, warnings, instincts, were they documented? Or did they vanish beneath the new brickwork of the sewer age? The vanishing trade memory, machines, and the quiet legacy. By the end of the 19th century, the world had changed beyond recognition for those who once trudged through narrow alleyways with night carts and buckets, sloshing with the detritus of urban life. The gong farmer, as a figure of medieval necessity, had all but vanished. But while the job title disappeared from records and the profession itself merged into modern sanitation departments, the deeper question remains: what happened to their knowledge? It's easy to overlook the expertise developed by the generations of waste workers who toiled through centuries of human mess. Yet they were, in many ways, the frontline observers of city life, silent monitors of human behavior, health patterns, and environmental decline. Though illiterate in many cases, they were empirical scientists in their own way. They knew how to judge the depth of a pit by the smell alone. They could tell if an area had suffered a rise in illness by the consistency or smell of waste. They knew which households threw out spoiled food instead of composting it. And they sensed the difference between normal night soil and the ominous signs of dysentery or worse. Some of this knowledge was indeed recorded, but not by the workers themselves. Physicians and city planners sometimes interviewed waste haulers in the early 1800s to inform public health studies. Reports from the General Board of Health in England in the 1840s contained curious footnotes, where unnamed workers described seepage behaviors of soil or how the presence of dead rats near cesspits could indicate structural collapse. In Paris, the Vendanger's French equivalents to gong farmers were part of Baron Haussmann's urban overhaul during the Second Empire. Haussmann's vast reconstruction of Paris into broad boulevards and sewer-lined streets required not just engineers, but the cooperation of those who knew where wastes collected and how to divert it. Many wastesmen were consulted in secret, according to municipal archives, though their names were rarely recorded. Despite their contributions, there was no ceremony when the job ended. No medals, no plaques, no memorials to those who spent lifetimes waist-deep in the waste of others. Instead, their trade faded into the murky backdrop of progress even as modern sanitation improved. New roles emerged that bore a ghostly resemblance to the gong farmer's path: sewage plant workers, septic tank technicians, wastewater engineers. These roles, now built on science and regulation, owe their existence to the grim, practical knowledge of those who came before. And yet, few of these newer workers are aware of their medieval lineage. The 20th century further distanced us from the memory of manual waste removal. Plumbing became so efficient in sanitation, so taken for granted that the very idea of someone having to physically collect human waste became alien. The silence that fell over the legacy of the gong farmer was not out of disrespect necessarily, but from cultural forgetting. Filth, after all, is something most people are eager to move past, but their story lingers in unexpected ways. In parts of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the practice of manual scavenging removing human waste from dry latrines persisted well into the late 20th and even 21st century. In India, for example, the practice was officially banned in 1993 and again in 2013. Though it still exists in marginalized communities, these workers, predominantly from Dalit, formerly untouchable castes, perform duties shockingly similar to their European predecessors, removing waste by hand, often barefoot, using crude tools. Here lies a painful echo: the social ostracization, the lack of alternatives. The systemic neglect. These conditions are not relics of the medieval past, but aspects of present-day life for many. In this way, the gong farmer's story becomes a window not just into how societies deal with waste, but how they treat the people who handle it. Back in England, a few traces remain. Place names like Gong Street in some towns or entries in tax records preserved in local archives at York's City Museum. A display on medieval sanitation features a reconstructed gong farmer's outfit, layers of wool, leather boots, and a hooked pole. A plaque reads, "Without him, the streets would have choked in filth." Some modern historians have begun reevaluating the gong farmer's role as part of the broader conversation on labor history. In academic journals, they appear alongside chimney sweeps, miners, and match girls, figures once dismissed as peripheral, now understood as essential cogs in the machinery of society. But perhaps the most lasting tribute to the gong farmer is not in books or museums. It's in the quiet function of your everyday life. Every time you flush a toilet, every time a sewer system whisks away what once would have remained in a pit, you are benefiting from generations of anonymous workers who once did it all by hand. Their lives may have been short, their names unrecorded, but their work necessary, thankless, and repellent helped shape the modern city. Civilization, as it turns out, is built not just by kings and architects, but by those who carried the bucket, shoveled the trench, and kept the streets from drowning in their own waste. And so, we end with a quiet question. In an age of automation and technological advancement, do we remember the human labor that once stood between us and collapse? Or have we buried their stories deeper than even the filth they once cleared? The salt that soured a nation. You are standing in the French countryside, sometime in the mid-18th century. The wheat sways under a waning sun, church bells toll in the distance, and a heavily cloaked figure on horseback arrives in the village square. Not a nobleman, nor a priest, but someone far less welcome. A gabelle collected all to you. Salt may be just a table staple, but for pre-revolutionary France, salt was power, politics, and resentment crystallized. The gabelle, the salt tax, was one of the most despised impositions of the Ancien regime. It was enforced through a system so complex and unequal that even minor acts of resistance could lead to imprisonment, or worse. Yet behind this hated system stood ordinary men, tax agents, scribes, and local enforcers who bore the full brunt of public hatred but lived, often poorly, in the shadow of a tax that shaped French history more than most remember. The gabelle had ancient roots. Salt, a necessity for preserving meat and fish in an era without refrigeration, had long been taxed across Europe. But in France, it reached a uniquely oppressive form, first officially implemented under King Philippe VI in 1341. The salt tax became a permanent fixture of French life, and by the 17th century had grown into a vast and inequitable bureaucracy. The key injustice lay in its regional disparities. France was divided into several zones based on how much salt tax they paid. Some regions, called pays de grande en gabelle, bore the heaviest burden. Others, pays de court bouillon or pays exempts, paid little or none. To live a few miles across a tax border could mean the difference between a manageable life and financial hardship. In the Grande Gabelle areas, adults were legally required to purchase a minimum quantity of salt per year, whether they needed it or not. This was known as the sel obligatoire, or obligatory salt. Citizens were forbidden from sharing it, gifting it, or using it outside strict rules. Even using salt to make cheese or curing hides without permission was illegal. To enforce these complex and deeply resented laws, the monarchy employed a network of tax collectors, inspectors, and soldiers. These weren't the grand tax farmers of Versailles, but rather petty officials known locally as gabelle salt agents, tasked with tracking salt movement, enforcing purchase quotas, and uncovering smuggling. And the smuggling was rampant. Peasants often turned to smuggling simply to survive. They would cross from low-tax to high-tax regions under cover of night, salt hidden in satchels, in wagon wheels, even sewn into the hems of skirts. Smuggling rings developed, sometimes involving entire families or parishes. This brought the gabellists into daily conflict with the people. They were often hated, shunned, and sometimes violently attacked, yet their own lives were far from luxurious. Many gabellists were Laurenkin clerks or former soldiers, paid little more than subsistence wages. The job was unpleasant and isolating. In some towns, salt collectors were required to live separately from the population and forbidden from owning land, attending certain markets, or marrying into local families. These restrictions were meant to prevent corruption but also marked them as permanent outsiders. One gabelle collector's logbook from 1762, discovered in the departmental archives of the Loire, records repeated requests for security assistance. The house of Monsieur Lapierre was stoned after he refused to exempt a widow's family from her salt dues. He requests again for the presence of guards on market days. Another document from Arles describes a gabellist being beaten by smugglers disguised as traveling priests, the fermiers généraux, wealthy tax farmers who leased the right to collect taxes from the crowns of Assault's local agents. They were enormously wealthy, many living in Parisian luxury, but the gabellists saw none of that wealth. They were tools in the broader machine, scapegoats for decisions made far above their station. What's perhaps most striking is how meticulously the system was organized. Salt was stored in royal depots, greniers a cell, and dispensed in measured quantities. Purchasers had to record their identities and how the salt would be used. Inspectors could visit homes to verify use. Salt used for livestock, acceptable. Salt for fish preservation, permitted with a different rate. Salt gifted to a neighbor, illegal and subject to fines or imprisonment. This surveillance turned ordinary life into a bureaucratic tangle, and it made enemies of those who enforced it. There are countless records of gabblers living under threat. In some towns, locals refused to sell them bread or meat. In others, agents sent their families away for safety. Those who persisted often became desensitized to the conflict. They moved from town to town, enforcing the law, taking bribes when they could, and keeping detailed logs of who owed what. A curious survival is the 1769 journal of Etienne Moreau, a junior salt officer stationed in Berry, in calm, detached handwriting. He describes his daily duties, visited the farm of Jules Lemata. 2 women were stirring brine, not accounted for by registry. Issued fine of 6 livres. They wept, requested pardon, cannot oblige. Moreau's entries are mechanical but occasionally betray fatigue. Another dispute today. A child was found carrying a pouch with salt and dried herring. I believe it was. Not meant for commerce, but law is law. The salt collectors knew their work was despised. Some took pride in precision. Others developed cynicism or drank to forget their station. And then, in the late 1780s, as revolution simmered, they began to vanish. Villages revolted. Salt depots were looted. Gabblers were driven out, some tarred and feathered, others imprisoned or killed. The salt tax, once a pillar of royal revenue, became a symbol of tyranny. And in the first days of the French Revolution, the gabelle was formally abolished. But what happened to the gabblers after the revolution? Did they disappear quietly? Were they punished, absorbed into the new system, or forgotten entirely? Revolution, reprisal, and the disappearance of the gabelous year was 1789. The streets of Paris swelled with hunger. The salons murmured of Rousseau, and the countryside smoldered with resentment. Bread was scarce, taxes endless, and faith in the monarchy was cracking. Among the many grievances listed in the Cahiers de doléances, those famous ledgers of public complaint drafted ahead of the Estates General none appeared more frequently, nor more bitterly, than complaints about the gabelle, the salt tax. It had long been hated, but now, in the heat of revolutionary sentiment, that hate turned into action. In the rural provinces, especially those most burdened by the Grande Gabelle, the salt tax was one of the first laws to be openly defied. Salt depots were looted, tax offices burned, and gabellistos obscure, paper-bound enforcers of a complex system suddenly found themselves enemies of the people. One of the earliest violent acts of the revolution occurred in Brittany, where peasants surrounded a salt warehouse, tore down the royal seals, and distributed the contents to the crowd. The guards fled. The gabelle collector, a man named Pierre-Michel Brunet, disappeared whether by resignation or coercion. The records do not say. The deeper question is, what became of the gabblers in this atmosphere of vengeance and upheaval? Many were dismissed, quietly, after the storming of the Bastille. The National Assembly abolished the gabelle in March of 1790. This decision was both symbolic and practical. The tax had become untenable. Enforcement was collapsing, and the revolutionary government needed to signal a break from the Ancien regime. Some former salt collectors were absorbed into the new municipal structures, especially those with clerical skills. These men, who once tallied salt quotas, now copied minutes for revolutionary committees, tracked requisitions, or managed grain stores. Their bureaucratic competence made them useful, even if their pasts were uncomfortable. But others were less fortunate. In Avignon, a former gabbalist named Antoine Collier was denounced by his neighbors. They accused him of spying on Christian salt users and enforcing royal tyranny through brine. Whether these charges were literal or sarcastic is unclear, but Collier was arrested during the Terror, and his fate remains undocumented. In Limoges, a group of gabolists tried to organize a petition for their pensions, citing their decades of service. The petition, housed in the National Archives, is heartbreaking in tone. We ask not for favor, only recognition that we served France loyally, though the laws be now changed. We seek bread and dignity, not privilege. The revolutionary government ignored them. It's worth noting that the fall of the gabelle didn't end the problems of salt distribution. Salt was still needed urgently for food preservation, livestock, and especially the preservation of fish for naval provisioning. But in the absence of a tax framework, chaos reigned. The revolutionary authorities tried to institute a free market approach, but salt prices fluctuated wildly. Hoarding became common. Fishmongers complained of spoiled cargo. Salt riots occurred in Marseille, where poor citizens blamed speculators for the soaring price of what had once been strictly regulated, albeit unjustly so. The irony is inescapable. A tax that had been resented for its structure was now, in its absence, revealing the perils of deregulation. Some municipalities quietly revived aspects of the old system not as a tax, but as a controlled supply system. Salt depots were reopened. Permits were issued again, though under new names, and in some cases, the very same men who had once been gabellists were rehired, not as royal enforcers, but as humble commissaires de sel. These were not glamorous roles. Their pay was lower than before, their social status unchanged. and their protection gone. One anonymous record from the Var department notes that former saltmen face insults and threats, but are the only ones who understand depot procedure. The line is telling. Knowledge mattered, even when the bearer of that knowledge was despised. What's more, some former gabblers became smugglers themselves. This odd reversal is documented in the court records of Bisenkin, where a man once known as Inspector de Sel was caught leading a small ring of illicit salt traders. He claimed in his defense that he had a duty to ensure salt reached the people, and had acted out of civic necessity. He was fined but not imprisoned. Others simply vanished. Their names fell off the rolls. They were replaced by revolutionaries, functionaries, or younger men with cleaner reputations. The gabelle would, incredibly, return. In 1806, under Napoleon Bonaparte, the salt tax was reinstated. The emperor, ever practical, needed revenue. Though unpopular, the gabelle was easy to collect and enforce. The infrastructure still existed, the depots remained, and some of the old staff, now a generation older, were quietly brought back into service. But the nature of the tax had changed. It was less cruel, more rational. The vast regional disparities were reduced. No longer were peasants required to purchase set quotas. Enforcement relied more on inventory tracking and less on domestic surveillance. Still, the word gabelle had been forever tainted. After Napoleon's fall, the Bourbon Restoration maintained the tax. It lingered through the July Monarchy, and it was not fully abolished until 1946. Yes, the gabelle, in some form, lasted into the mid-20th century, but by then, the gabblists were gone. Their descendants had long since become accountants, municipal clerks, railway inspectors, no longer cloaked men riding into villages with royal writs and salt tallies. They were absorbed into the anonymous engine of bureaucracy. What remained was their reputation of bitter memory, passed down in stories. In rural France especially, in the Vendean Berry, the word gabblist persisted as an insult. It denoted meddling, officiousness, or betrayal of the common folk. One wonders, did the salt collectors themselves ever reflect on the role they played? Were they villains in their own minds? Or simply men trying to survive within a system not of their making? And more curiously, when the system vanished, and their authority with it, did they miss the structure it gave to their otherwise invisible lives? The legacy of salt and the disappearance of accountability. Imagine a world where something as basic as salt, a grain of mineral, could define your place in society, dictate your movements, and determine who you feared. For the gabblist, tax collectors of France's infamous salt system, it defined their entire purpose. But as revolutions passed, systems changed, and new regimes rose from the ashes of the old. These men were quietly erased from memory, their role in one of the most notorious tax systems of Europe both infamous and ignored. In post-Napoleonic France, as the monarchy was restored, the gabelle resumed, albeit in a somewhat reformed state. But the social wounds left by its most oppressive forms lingered. Former gabblists, if they remained in government service, were often reassigned to lower clerical duties or provincial inspection posts. Their reputations followed them. Unlike soldiers or teachers whose contributions were romanticized or honored, salt tax agents were rarely, if ever, memorialized. No monuments commemorate their service. No schools bear their names. In the official narrative of post-revolutionary France, they were ghosts, bureaucratic phantoms whose association with the ancien regime was quietly omitted, yet their story leaves behind a critical question. How do we deal with those who served an unjust system but did not design it? Many gabblists were born into the trade, or entered it out of necessity. Some were conscripted from the lower nobility, others from peasant stock looking for modest employment. In practice, most were caught between the grind of upward compliance and downward contempt. They did not write the laws, they simply enforced them, navigating an impossible position. Be too strict and invite public hatred. Be too lenient and risk punishment from the crown. A diary fragment from a provincial gabblist named Jean-Luc Lobo, discovered in a municipal archive in Charente, offers a moment of painful self-reflection. Each day I collect salt from those who cannot afford meat. I ask for coin from mothers who have none. The people spit at me, yet I must return with ledger's balance, or I too shall be punished. Is there virtue in obedience when the law is cruel? Delabord's musings are rare, but poignant. He is not defending the system, merely describing the moral tension of his position. And in this tension lies the broader story of the gabblists, men burdened by duty, stained by association, and forgotten by history. By the late 19th century, with the salt tax gradually diminished and reduced to a mere footnote in the national budget, the remnants of the old gabelle system were finally dismantled. The last of the regional salt depots were decommissioned. Their records, stored in musty archives, were often destroyed or lost in wars, floods, or disinterest. Some buildings survived. In towns like Salmore and Tours, former salt warehouses became post offices, schools, or apartments. Their origins were known only to a few local historians. Curiously, France's memory of the gabelle lives on more clearly in language and literature than in stone or steel, in the works of Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, and even satirical pamphlets. of the 19th century, gabblers are painted as petty tyrants, paper pushers wielding power over salt, the symbol of daily survival. But like many symbols, this image became simplified, exaggerated, and ultimately detached from the complex reality. Many ways. The gabblers were early casualties of a broader historical phenomenon, the invisibility of Middle Agents. These are the people who enforce rules they did not write, who suffer blame for policies they cannot change, and who vanish when the regime collapses. Their disappearance was not mourned, nor was it celebrated. It simply happened. Today, the word gabelle is known mainly to historians or students of the French Revolution. It occasionally appears in crossword puzzles, or as a historical reference in a museum plaque, but few people remember the lives behind the term, the men who paced salt depots with ink-stained fingers, tallying brine, arguing with farmers, and bearing the daily weight of hatred as professionally as they bore the weight of their ledgers, and what of the salt itself. Salt, once taxed and hoarded, became abundant with industrial extraction and modern trade. Its value plummeted. Today it sits forgotten on tables, spilled without concern, sold in massive sacks for less than a cup of coffee. The mineral that once sparked riots and sustained empires is now almost worthless. But value is not only monetary, it's historical. Salt helped build cities, it helped preserve navies, and in France, it sustained a fiscal system whose engine helped ignite one of the most famous revolutions in world history. And the gabblists, their story reminds us that oppressive systems are not upheld by monsters alone. Often they are maintained by ordinary people, functionaries, clerks, minor officials, each performing a small task that, when added together, creates vast machinery. Which raises an unsettling question. How many forgotten systems in our own time are maintained by people doing jobs they neither designed nor control? We rarely remember them, but we should. Before the spark, life inside Pudding Lane, it was a quiet Sunday. Early September in 1666, the Thames flowed slowly past the city, swelling with trade and timber, filled with narrow alleys, wooden homes, and tightly packed storefronts. In Pudding Lane, near the northern edge of London Bridge, a baker named Thomas Farrinor, foreigner, as some records spell, attended his day like many before, sweeping flour from stone floors, banking coals in the oven, locking the shop door. It was an ordinary night in an extraordinary time. London had survived plague the year before. Its streets buzzed with new life. But the fire that would start in Farrinor's bakery would erase over 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and nearly every civic building in central London. Yet this is not a story about the fire itself. It is the story of the people who baked bread in the hours and days leading up to it, the forgotten bakers of 17th century London, and of how their quiet trade, vital and overlooked, was the fulcrum on which an entire city tipped into catastrophe. To understand their world, you must first understand their ovens. Baking in early modern London was not merely a domestic activity. It was a regulated trade, run through guilds, licensing systems, and customary law. Bakers were governed by the Worshipful Company of Bakers, one of London's ancient livery companies. They divided their ranks into white bakers, who baked fine wheaten bread for wealthier households, and brown bakers, who baked coarser loaves for the poor. Their ovens were massive, brick-lined, fire-heated, and vented through small chimneys. They required hours of heat build-up before baking, often fueled by bundles of faggot small wood sticks, or even scrap timber from the bustling shipyards along the Thames. In crowded neighborhoods like Pudding Lane, these ovens sat close to timber beams, thatched extensions, and cloth canopies used to dry dough. While official ordinances prohibited open flames and poorly maintained chimneys, enforcement was lax. Records from the City of London courts show repeated citations for bakers operating without fireproof ceilings or for storing kindling too close to their ovens. Thomas Farrinor himself had faced such complaints. His shop was modest but well placed. Pudding Lane was busy, lined with butchers, grocers, and taverns that relied on his bread. He baked for the Royal Navy, supplying hardtack and ship's biscuited dry, long-lasting bread used for provisioning. His contract made him one of the more successful bakers in the city, though by no means famous. His apprenticized young men from poorer families worked long hours in hot, flour-choked rooms. They lived above the bakery, as was common, sleeping near storerooms filled with flour, sacks, and wooden implements. Mice were a constant menace, so too were rats. In many shops, the animals chewed through flour bags, making it necessary to store grain in elevated bins or barrels suspended from beams. The bakers rose long before dawn, usually between 2 and 3 a.m., to heat the ovens. The firewood had to be arranged precisely. The walls of the oven had to glow a certain dull orange, the heat radiating evenly before baking could begin. They could not rely on thermometers. Of course, heat was judged by hand, by breath, by years of bodily memory. Bakers' apprentices, usually between the ages of 12 and 20, suffered the brunt of the labor. They were responsible for stoking fires, kneading dough, carrying sacks of flour from mills at Billingsgate or upstream depots near Islington. Their hands were raw from salt and grain. their lungs thick with flour dust. Anecdotes from the time speak of apprentices fainting near ovens, especially during summer months. Others developed chronic coughs or skin infections, yet the demand for bread never waned. In a city of over 400,000, bread was the staple of life. Every household, from pauper to peer, consumed it daily. The regulation of bakers extended even into pricing. The assize of bread and ale, first enacted in the 13th century, remained active. It fixed the weight and price of loaves according to the cost of grain. Each week, city authorities posted official bread prices. Bakers caught overcharging or short-weighing their loaves were fined or pilloried. Some bakers cheated the system with hollow loaves or excessive flour in their doughs, but many were honest craftsmen, proud of their trade and mindful of the narrow line they walked between feeding the city and angering it. Despite their essential role, bakers were not held in high esteem. Popular literature often painted them as miserly or careless. Satirical ballads from the period include references to ash bread and sawdust loaves. One such verse from 1657 reads, "The baker's heart is light as flour. He sells his weight by half the hour, if bread be short or mouldy still. He blames the scales, not his own will." Yet behind the satire was a deeper reality. The city relied on these men. Every morning, carts laden with bread rattled across bridges, down alleys, and into markets. Bakers had to rise early, work in unbearable heat, and yet remain invisible, and, in this invisibility, perhaps, lay the seeds of tragedy. The night of September 1st, 1666, was unseasonably warm. The city, still recovering from the Great Plague, was dry from months of little rain. Farino's bakery was closed, the ovens banked, but according to later testimony, embers were left smoldering in one of the hearths. At approximately 1 a.m., a servant awoke to the smell of smoke. The bakery was ablaze. Farino escaped, as did his daughter and a servant, but one apprentice whose name remains unknown perished in the fire. He was likely asleep above the bakery near the flour bins and timber beams. The fire spread quickly. A strong easterly wind fanned the flames westward, leaping from house to house, fed by stores of timber, pitch, and cloth. Within hours, it reached Thames Street and engulfed the riverside warehouses dotted with the city. At first, did not blame the bakery. The Lord Mayor delayed action. Firefighting methods at the time included pulling down houses to create fire breaks, a task requiring royal or mayoral authority. Delays proved fatal. By the time decisive action was taken, the fire had become unstoppable. Later, when the ashes cooled and accusations flew, attention returned to pudding lane. A question emerged: was Thomas Fariner responsible? Did he neglect to extinguish his ovens properly? Had he allowed a fire to smolder too close to kindling or flour? Could a simple act of exhaustion or routine have brought London to its knees? Fariner denied all wrongdoing. He testified that the oven was cool, the fire out. Others pointed to his prior citations for poor fire safety, but no legal charges were filed. Still, one cannot help but wonder, what did Fariner feel in the days after the fire? What did his fellow bakers think, knowing that one of their own may have inadvertently sparked a disaster that destroyed the city, displaced tens of thousands, and ushered in a rebuilding that would take decades? And beyond guilt or blame, what happened to the bakers themselves in the wake of the fire? With their shops gone, flour stores destroyed, and ovens reduced to rubble, how did they survive? Ashes and absence. Bakers in a broken city. The Great Fire of London did more than burn buildings. It tore through neighborhoods, businesses, and lives, including the quiet trade of the city's bakers. By the time the flames were finally contained, on September 6, 1666, over 400 acres of the city lay in ruin. What was once a dense thicket of timber-framed buildings had been reduced to smoking heaps of rubble and ash. Among the casualties were at least 400 bakeries, each of them the economic heart of a household or a family trade. Thomas Fariner, whose shop on Pudding Lane was widely believed to be the fire's point of origin, survived the blaze, as did most of his family. But his livelihood, like that of so many others in the baking trade, was destroyed, and the question lingered in the charred air: what now for the bakers? For the first time in their lives, many found themselves not only jobless but homeless, because most bakeries were built with living quarters overhead. The loss of a shop meant the loss of shelter. A baker's home, business, tools, and ingredients were all typically stored under one wooden roof, and so, in a single night, centuries of craft and security vanished into smoke. For weeks after the fire, bakers could be seen wandering the outskirts of the city. Many camped in makeshift tents at Moorfields or near the ruins of St. Paul's. Some tried to continue baking with borrowed tools and temporary ovens. Others turned to laboring in cleanup efforts, clearing debris, hauling bricks, or removing the dead from the ruins. The bread they once produced had become, for many, a luxury they could no longer afford to eat. Interestingly, while the fire was destructive, it brought about a strange side effect: an immediate drop in bread prices. The fire destroyed many granaries and created a short-term surplus of flour stockpiles intended for citywide distribution that could no longer be baked. into bread at their original destinations. With distribution systems in chaos, large-scale bakers just outside the burn zone flooded the market with bread to meet emergency needs, often undercutting traditional prices. The government, fearing famine and unrest, encouraged this with emergency market orders for surviving bakers. This meant even fewer opportunities to recover. Not only had they lost their ovens and clients, but now their primary product was being sold at low margins by newcomers and opportunists. Despite this, the worshipful Company of Bakers remained active. It was one of the few institutions to maintain its internal records during the disaster. In the weeks following the fire, the company organized emergency assemblies, coordinated donations, and petitioned the crown for aid to rebuild a surviving. Ledger from October 1666 lists the names of over 200 bakers who applied for relief funds. The entries are terse and haunting. Thomas Whitcomb, oven destroyed, no tools, wife and child missing. Anne Giles' widow ran a small bakehouse near Cornhill. Nothing remains. Richard Holloway, injured during fire, requests flour to begin. Again, it is notable how many women appear on the rolls. While the baking trade was formerly male-dominated and organized through guilds, widows often inherited bakehouses or ran small-scale bread operations, especially in poorer districts. These women, many without guild protections, were among the most severely affected by the fire. Some bakers, including Ferriner himself, were able to rebuild. He resumed baking shortly after the fire and, within 2 years, resecured a Royal Navy contract, whether due to personal connections, legal leniency, or simple necessity. His business continued. Others were not so lucky. Many apprentices were forced to break their indentures. With no bakery to train in, their 7-year contracts became meaningless. A number of these young men turned to other trades, often becoming masons, laborers, or chimney sweeps as the city began the monumental task of reconstruction. This reconstruction, led in part by Sir Christopher Wren and various city surveyors, introduced a radical change. New fire codes, the Rebuilding Act of 1667, mandated that future buildings in London be made of brick or stone, not timber. More importantly for bakers, it heavily regulated oven placement and chimney design. All new bakehouses were required to have thicker flues, fireproof walls, and sufficient air ventilation to reduce the chance of another disaster. These new requirements made the cost of rebuilding a bakery much higher. Some bakers banded together to share costs, forming early cooperative ventures. Others turned to creditors or borrowed from livery companies, but for many, the financial burden was too steep. They never returned to the trade. The bakeries that did re-emerge were different in character. Larger, better regulated, and more centrally supervised. They bore little resemblance to the tight, smoky shops of pre-fire London. In this way, the fire did not just destroy bakeries, it redefined the profession. And yet, the people did not forget. For years after the fire, rumors persisted about the cause. While Ferriner had escaped legal punishment, popular opinion remained suspicious. Some saw the fire as divine retribution, others as a sign of political unrest. A few accused Catholics or foreign agents. In this climate, a man who baked bread near gunpowder depots and failed to extinguish his oven was always going to be viewed with caution. The king himself, Charles II, offered clemency to many accused of negligence. He declared the fire a most sad visitation of God's wrath and encouraged public forgiveness. Even so, trust in bakers took time to return. In Pudding Lane, nothing remained of Ferriner's shop. The street was cleared, renamed in some documents as part of King Street Ward. A monument was later erected nearby Christopher Wren's monument to the Great Fire of London, which still stands today, a tall column of Portland stone rising over the rebuilt city. Ironically, the original plaque on the monument made no mention of Fertino. Instead, it blamed the fire vaguely on popish frenzy, a political scapegoat of the times. Later versions were more restrained. And the bakers. They returned slowly, quietly, and without fanfare. Their new ovens were fireproof, their chimneys tall and well vented. Yet the city never again housed so many bakehouses in so small a space. Some of the pre-fire traditions survived. Bread pricing still followed the assumptions. Apprenticeships continued, though fewer in number. But something had shifted in public perception. The baker was no longer invisible. He had become, for a time, the center of a city's greatest catastrophe. But did this sudden attention bring any lasting change in how bakers were viewed? Or did the city, once rebuilt and warm with the smell of rising loaves, simply forget once more the hands that fed it? Crumbs of memory, the post-fire baker and the rise of industrial bread. By the end of the 17th century, London had been transformed. The Great Fire of 1666 was no longer fresh in the minds of its citizens, but the landscape still bore the marks of its fury. Wide new streets had replaced tangled medieval alleys. Stone and brick stood where timber once reigned. Tall chimneys loomed overhead, each one a nod to the inferno that had once consumed the city's heart. Among the many trades affected by this reconstruction, none had been so fundamentally reshaped as the bakers. Once anonymous men working over open fires in crowded wooden buildings, They now found themselves operating under stricter rules, heavier oversight, and increasing public scrutiny. The transformation of the baking trade was not immediate, but it was steady. After the fire, the worshipful company of bakers worked closely with city planners to re-establish London's bread supply. Surviving bakers were encouraged to set up shop in new districts, often with financial assistance from the company or through low-interest loans secured by guild connections. However, rebuilding a bakehouse was no small feat. The new fire regulations required brick or stone walls at least 18 inches thick, chimneys with flues lined in clay, oven hearths raised and insulated, proper separation between fuel storage and baking areas. These requirements pushed many small-scale bakers out of the trade. They simply couldn't afford to rebuild within the city. Some moved to nearby villages or took up baking in estate kitchens. Others joined larger baking operations as journeymen, hired hands working in expanded bakehouses that now served entire parishes or districts. One such bakehouse, rebuilt in 1670 on Bread Street, an appropriately named location, was capable of producing over 2,000 loaves a day. It had 6 ovens, a staff of over a dozen men, and even employed 2 women as neat at the time. This was no longer the modest wood-beamed bakery of Pudding Lane. It was early industrial baking. And yet, for all the expansion, the human rhythms remained much the same. Bakers still rose in the dark, still judged oven heat by the feel of stone, still worked barefoot on flour-dusted floors. Apprentices still endured long hours, and even in larger shops, the dangers of heat, heavy labor, and flour inhalation remained. But now, they did so under closer watch. Inspectors from the guild or city council would drop in without warning to check chimney safety, flour weights, or bread pricing. Meanwhile, the public's relationship with bread shifted subtly. In the pre-fire years, bread was often purchased directly from bakers or at small market stalls. Post-fire distribution became more centralized. Large bakehouses contracted with vendors, mostly women known as breadwives, who would sell loaves from baskets door to door or at roadside stalls. This distanced bakers from the final consumer, making their work even more invisible once again. But memory lingered. For decades after the fire, common superstition attached a sense of danger to bakeries. In ballads and pamphlets, references to oven fires or baker's blaze became shorthand for carelessness. A popular verse in the 1680s warned, "Where flour sleeps, 'neath timber steep, and ovens burn where children sleep. Remember well that bitter flame, the baker's hearth, the city's shame." Even as London grew and the trauma of 1666 receded, bakeries continued to carry a faint whiff of public suspicion. This suspicion was not about morality, but about competence. It was a fear of recurrence. And so, for many bakers, especially those whose families had lived through the fire, caution became a professional virtue. By the early 18th century, new pressures emerged. Commercialization. Mills on the outskirts of London began to mechanize. Water and wind-powered mills could now process flour in vast quantities. With more flour came the rise of larger baking operations. These proto-factories began to dominate the trade, especially in East London and Southwark, pushing small family bakeries further toward the margins. Bread itself also changed. The classic wheaten loaf of the earlier centuries gave way to white bread, increasingly preferred by wealthier households. This required more refined flour, a longer process, and different oven management. Coarser breads, once the standard for working people, were now seen as undesirable, even shameful to meet. This demand, bakers had to adopt new techniques, alum additives, bleaching agents, and other questionable shortcuts. The baking trade, once a craft, became a balancing act between tradition and adaptation. And with this shift came new dangers, not of fire, but of fraud. Pamphlets from the 1740s decried the debasement of our daily bread, accusing bakers of adding chalk, bone meal, or even powdered plaster to produce wider, lighter loaves. In response, the city launched inquiries. Bakers were summoned to defend their methods. Some claimed innocence. Others blamed the millers. Still others were fined or banned from selling bread for a time. The irony is sharp. Once accused of burning the city, bakers were now accused of poisoning it, though in truth, most were simply trying to keep up with changing tastes and competitive pressures. By the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the London baker bore little resemblance to his 17th forebear. He worked in a larger shop, used standardized weights and measures, and baked bread that traveled farther than ever before. Yet the core of the trade remained tactile, physical, and quietly vital. As the city continued to expand into the Georgian and Victorian ages, the memory of the Great Fire faded. Farina's name slipped into obscurity. Pudding Lane was rebuilt, eventually marked by a small plaque. The monument rose nearby, tall and dignified, but offering little in the way of human remembrance. There is no marker for the unnamed apprentice who died in the fire's first hour. No monument for the women who sold bread in its chaotic aftermath. No statue for the kneaders who returned to work even as ash still drifted through the air. And yet, their legacy lives on in the shape of the city, in the architecture of ovens, in the quiet expectation that bread, warm and fresh, will appear each morning regardless of calamity. History often records the flames. It rarely records the flour. But in the soot and silence after the fire, the bakers rebuilt. Not as heroes, not as villains. Just as people doing the same work they had always done, feeding a city that was always hungrier than it knew. And so, we are left to ponder, in our modern world of factory bread and supermarket shelves, have we lost the quiet connection between the hands that bake and the mouths that eat? The long march nowhere treadwheels of the medieval world. Imagine for a moment, walking in place for hours, your feet pounding the same wooden steps, muscles burning, lungs pulling in damp air, all while the machine you drive groans beneath you. You are not going anywhere. You are not allowed to stop. And the work you do, if you can call it, that isn't even your own. You are inside a treadwheel, also called a treadmill in early forms, a giant, rotating wooden cylinder. It is part crane, part punishment device, part engineering marvel. It looms inside castle walls, cathedral scaffolds, and prison yards. It is one of the most misunderstood and least remembered tools of medieval labor to modern ears. The word treadmill conjures up images of gym floors and digital screens, but in the Middle Ages and early modern period, the treadmill was a very real, very physical piece of machinery designed, not for fitness, but for lifting heavy loads, stones, water, weapons, timber bells. Bells at the heart of the device was human power. The most common design was the treadwheel crane, a massive vertical wheel, 8 to 12 feet in diameter, into which a man, or in rarer cases, two would step and walk, like a hamster in a wheel. As the wheel turned, it pulled ropes or chains, wound around a shaft, raising or lowering materials. These cranes were used extensively during the construction of cathedrals, castles, and bridges from the 12th to the 16th centuries. Most workers inside these wheels were not volunteers. Many were prisoners, convicts, or indentured laborers. Some were simply poor men paid pennies a day, willing to endure the exhausting repetition in exchange for bread, soup, and shelter. Their names were rarely recorded. Their labor, literally and figuratively, went in circles. One of the most remarkable surviving descriptions comes from the building of Wells Cathedral in England, where records from 1313 detail payments to a treadwheel master whose job it was to supervise the wheel walkers lifting limestone blocks. These men worked in shifts of 4 to 6 hours, depending on heat, fatigue, and collapse rates. Yes, collapse was common. The physical toll of walking continuously inside a wooden wheel was immense. The angle of the internal steps forced the body forward at an unnatural tilt. The heat inside the wheel chamber could be unbearable in summer. In winter, icy air crept into the joints, stiffening limbs. Injuries included twisted knees, broken toes, and dangerously low blood sugar from overexertion. And yet, this system was astonishingly effective. A single man in a treadwheel could lift loads, several times his body weight up to 1,500 pounds, in some designs by simply walking upward, turning the wheel's axis and winding rope on a drum. In large construction projects, these cranes were mounted directly to scaffolding or towers. Some could even be rotated horizontally to position stones precisely. Treadwheel cranes were used in the construction of Notre Dame de Paris, Ely Cathedral, York Minster, and countless fortified castles across Europe. Some medieval manuscript illustrations depict workers on ladders beside the wheels, guiding the loads or adjusting the tension of the ropes. Yet these elegant drawings omit the sound, the creak of old timber, the labored breathing, the sweat, and slips, the dull pain of men trapped inside machines they neither owned nor understood. Then some regions. The treadwheel took on another identity, punishment device. By the 16th century, English prisons, particularly debtors' prisons, treadmills as forced labor instruments. These were not cranes, but what we might now call disciplinary treadmills. Long sloped drums with wooden slats or steps. Prisoners stepped on them in rotating fashion, hour after hour. Unlike the construction cranes, these treadmill devices were designed not to achieve a task, but to enforce motion. The work was aimless, pointless, a deterrent. Inmates would climb the rotating steps while holding a handrail, feet rising and falling in rhythm. Some prisons forced this activity for up to 8 hours a day, broken into intervals of 15 minutes, walking and 5 minutes rest. If a prisoner stopped or slowed, the wheel stopped, and with it, the prisoner's rations or privileges. One prison in London recorded this grim instruction: let the wheel turn, that the idle shall earn no rest. Without effort, no loaf without labor. Though most prominent in the 18th and 19th centuries, the seeds of this punishment treadmill can be found in earlier centuries, where the boundary between machine and penance blurred. Medieval chroniclers occasionally described monks imposing wheel-turning on disobedient novices under the guise of helping lift supplies, but clearly intended to humble or discipline. The moral framework of the age viewed labor as redemption. To walk without end inside a wheel, struggling, sweating, humiliated, was considered a fitting fate for sinners or criminals. What mattered wasn't the outcome, but the effort. Still, not all treadwheel workers were convicts. On some cathedral sites there were skilled tradesmen, operating cranes with remarkable precision. In places like Lubeck or Florence, wheel workers became semi-professional teams, responsible for managing lift loads during church bell installations or roof vaulting. These men knew how to balance weight, measure slack, and adjust for wind resistance. Even so, they were still subjected to brutal conditions. Their work was seen as mechanical, not intellectual. They were praised for stamina, not ingenuity. And when machines advanced, their usefulness waned by the 17th century. As pulley systems improved and wind or horse-powered hoists became more widespread, human treadwheels were phased out from major building sites, but their echoes lingered especially in prisons, where motion for its own sake became a favored punishment. The symbolism of the wheel, monotonous, repetitive, inescapable, was too perfect to ignore. And so we are left with a strange duality. The same machine that helped raise some of the most awe-inspiring cathedrals in Europe was also used to grind down the souls of society's poorest and most vulnerable. But what did life look like for those who walked the wheel day after day? Who trained them, fed them, replaced them when they collapsed? Did they find pride in the work, however repetitive? Or did the endless climbing wear down not just their bodies but their hope? Men of the wheel, life inside the medieval treadmills, after step, hour after hour, day after day. The men inside the treadwheels walked on, not forward, not upward, but simply in motion. For many it was the only motion available to them. Prisoners of war, debtors, criminals, or impoverished workers with no other way to earn their bread. While the treadwheel crane may have conjured images of construction and cathedral building, it was the daily, anonymous labor of countless workers that kept the wheels turning. Their lives, though often undocumented, were no less structured than the stones they lifted. To understand their experience, we must look at where these machines operated, who built them, and how the system of wheel labor developed across regions. The architecture of endless motion tread wheels were not simple machines, and their construction required specialized knowledge. Carpenters, stonemasons, and mechanics worked together to erect wooden scaffolds strong enough to support both the machine and the load it was designed to lift. In castles, the wheel was often placed inside a tower or near a fortified wall where heavy stone was being hoisted. At Carnarvon Castle in Wales, stone hoists likely operated via treadwheel cranes during late 13th century construction. Similar systems were used at the Tower of London, especially for moving barrels of supplies, as well as siege equipment. The wheel itself was made from hardwoods, typically oak or chestnut, constructed in large segments and fitted with internal slats or treads. A man stood inside, leaning forward into the wall, walking on the slats to turn the drum. The ropes wound around a central axle, often iron reinforced, connected to pulleys and guide beams. The machines creaked and groaned as they operated, the wood drying and swelling with moisture. In the cold, the joints cracked. In the summer heat made the air inside nearly suffocating. Who walked the wheels? The workers inside the wheels were seldom the stonemasons or architects who designed the buildings. Instead, they were what records blandly describe as laborers, a term that belied the skill and endurance required. Wage books from 14th century England show that treadwheel workers earned slightly more than agricultural peasants but less than skilled tradesmen. A treadwheel laborer at a cathedral site might earn 4 to 6 pence per day, barely enough for food, rent, and clothing. Few lasted long in the role. One surviving entry from a Flemish building site in 1382 notes, Wheelman Willem, age 28, replaced by Peter after fainting during lifting of choir stone, no broken bones but unable to return by vespers. This level of detail is rare. Most were simply crossed out of the ledger and replaced. In some towns, particularly during times of war or plague, the wheel was operated by convicts. In Italian city-states like Florence, non-violent offenders could be sentenced to public labor, including wheel work. Their sentences were displayed on boards near the site, and passers-by would sometimes throw food or insults. In France and the German states, itinerant laborsmen who moved from site to site would hire themselves out as wheel workers. They were sometimes known as pied lords or heavy feet, a term used both descriptively and mockingly. They formed a subculture of their own, sharing sleeping quarters near building sites and trading information about who paid on time, where the wheels were safest, and which foremen were cruel. There is no written poetry from these men, but there are echoes of their voices in court records, parish logs, and even marginalia. One anonymous note in the corner of a construction ledger at Strasbourg Cathedral reads, "I climb as the stones climb. They will be saints above. I will be bones below." A grim thought, but one that captures the disconnection between what they built and what they became. When work becomes punishment, as noted earlier, by the 16th and 17th centuries, the wheel, but it became a different kind of machine, one not of productivity, but of discipline. In prisons across England, and later in colonial outposts, the penal treadmill emerged as a tool of forced labor. These machines were horizontal or vertical drums with angled steps, requiring prisoners to walk in place for hours. Sometimes they powered mills or pumps. More often they powered nothing. The concept was simple. Motion equals obedience. Records from Coldbath Fields Prison in London describe prisoners walking treadmills for 6 hours per day, 6 days a week. Guards stood nearby with tally sticks, counting rotations. If a prisoner slacked, he might lose rations. If he resisted, he might be put in isolation. By the 1820s, the penal treadmill had become widespread in Britain, promoted as a way to instill discipline and extract labor, though this development came centuries after the medieval period. Its roots were already visible in how wheel labor had long been associated with submission, routine, and bodily control. Back in the medieval period, treadwheel labor was not yet explicitly punitive, but it occupied a similar space in the imagination. Hard, repetitive work that produced benefit for others, often under supervision, with no promise of advancement. Even when it was voluntary, it was seen as the lowest rung of construction labor. There are no guilds of wheel operators, no saints of the treadwheel, no commemorative plaques on cathedral walls honoring those who lifted the stones, and yet their footsteps are there in the bell towers, in the high vaults, in the bridges that still span rivers centuries later. Training the body for endless labor. One rarely considered question is, how did a person prepare for this kind of work? There is no evidence of formal apprenticeships. Most likely the task was passed down informally, one man showing another where to place his feet, how to time his steps, how to breathe without collapsing. Survival techniques included short, shallow steps to conserve energy, leaning against the wheel wall for balance, taking advantage of load changes, resting slightly when the lifted object was paused mid-air, listening for creaks or strain in the wheel structure, a primitive safety check. Diet mattered too. Workers consumed dense bread, salt pork, and watered ale to maintain energy. On some sites, wheelmen received extra portions of food in recognition of the physical burden, but medical care was limited. A strained ankle or a dislocated shoulder could end a laborer's career and his means of survival. And what of their families? Most of these men lived in temporary lodgings near construction sites or prison compounds. Some had wives who cooked and cleaned for work crews. Others lived alone, moving from job to job. Their families, if they had any, were often left behind, in distant villages. Despite their invisibility, the work of these men enabled architectural wonders. They lifted the stones for spires that still awe us. They raised bells that still toll. They built towers that still stand against the sky. And yet, when the machines were dismantled, when pulleys replaced steps and oxen replaced men, did anyone remember who walked the wheel? Or were they, like the wooden frames they powered, dismantled and forgotten? The wheel that turned without end, obsolescence and memory. Asterisk the treadwheel, part crane, part cage, part symbol. For centuries it served its purpose, lifting stone, punishing bodies, building monuments. But as the world changed and more efficient machines emerged, the treadwheel quietly disappeared, its creaking timbers left to rot in scaffolding yards, its walkers forgotten, its turning reduced to metaphor. By the early 17th century, new technologies began to take the place of human power. Windmills, watermills, counterweighted cranes, block and tackle systems, and eventually horse-powered capstans offered more efficient and less humanly costly means of lifting and transporting heavy loads. The relentless motion of feet inside a wooden wheel was no longer necessary for architecture to rise. On cathedral sites, cranes began to be powered by winding drums with counterweights, operated from ground-level military settings. Engineers deployed siege engines and pulley carts to raise cannon or supplies more quickly and with less risk of injury. The idea of placing a man inside a wheel came to be seen as outdated, even crude, and yet the image endured in the penal world. The treadwheel reappeared, not because it was effective at lifting weight, but because it was effective at wearing men down. British prisons in the 18th and 19th centuries brought the treadmill back not to build anything, but to discipline. In 1818, British engineer William Cubitt redesigned the treadmill as a penal device, now called the disciplinary wheel. It resembled a rotating staircase, where convicts ascended step after wooden step as the mechanism turned endlessly. Cubitt's version of the wheel sometimes powered grist mills or water pumps, but more often it powered nothing at all. The point wasn't labor, it was control. Prisoners on Cubitt's treadmills walked 6 to 10 hours per day, broken into half-hour intervals. Over the course of a year, a man might climb the equivalent of Mount Everest several times without ever leaving the prison yard. The treadmill produced nothing, improved nothing, and served only to exhaust. One reformer, writing in 1824, noted grimly, "There is something altogether appalling in the monotony of it. The step, the wheel, the descent, again and again, until mind and muscle rebel or forget how to rebel." Though this is later history than our medieval roots, it illustrates the enduring symbolic power of the wheel as a machine of suffering. In the medieval period, the wheel was at least productive. Its turning built cities, raised cathedrals, fed armies. But by the time of the penal treadmill, that same movement had become a tool of punishment, divorced from purpose. And even before the penal era, the symbolism had already begun to take shape in medieval Christian theology. The Wheel of Fortune Road of Fortuna was a popular image. The idea that fate spins us upward or downward with no warning, no fairness, and no escape. Artists depicted kings rising to glory and falling to ruin, all turning on the same wheel. The metaphor resonated because it reflected real life, especially for those whose daily labor was literally circular. Those inside the physical treadwheels may have felt the same truth in their bones. We have no direct testimony from the wheel, walkers of the 13th or 14th centuries, no diaries, no poems, but their work is still visible in the world they built. The bell towers of Chartres, whose massive stones were hoisted with treadwheel cranes. The battlements of Crac-des-Chapeliers raised under siege conditions, with men marching in place inside. The wheel, the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals across Europe, constructed with a labor rhythm as precise and unrelenting as the treadwheel itself in every case. The treadwheel was merely a tool. It amplified human strength. It extended what was possible, but it also imposed limits on the body, on the spirit, and on the worker's identity. One rarely discussed fact is that many of the wheel operators were seen as replaceable, even disposable. If one collapsed, another stepped in. When stone quotas were delayed or bad weather ruined work schedules, the blame often fell on the wheelman, not the weather. They were accused of laziness, malingering, or sabotage and never fatigue. Even so, they walked because walking the wheel meant eating that day. It meant not being on the outside, jobless, homeless, nameless. And that brings us to one final uncomfortable truth. Though the treadwheel faded from medieval construction by the 1600s, its logic endured. The idea that labor must be repetitive, thankless, and punishing in order to be real work persisted. In many ways, the modern factory, a row of men or women performing the same action over and over, is descended from the same mentality. Motion without meaning, output without ownership. Today's treadmills sit in gyms, humming quietly beneath the feet of people who walk in place by choice, often staring at screens or tracking steps with digital counters. The contrast is striking, from survival to self-improvement, from forced motion to voluntary motion. Yet the symbol remains, and perhaps that is the most important. Legacy of the medieval treadwheel, not the machines themselves, they are long dismantled. Not the men, they are unnamed, but the idea that motion can be both liberation and confinement, depending entirely on who is walking, and why the stones remain. The builders do not. The wheel turned, then stopped. And so we ask, when we speak of progress today, of building, moving forward, climbing, how much of it still relies on someone else walking in place, quietly, endlessly, behind the scenes? In the marshes, by bare hand, the leap of the crown. It is a misty morning in Tudor England. The year is perhaps 1532. The air smells of wet earth and rotting vegetation beneath your feet. Soft ground squelches, heavy with the night dew. The sun is not yet fully risen, and your boots are long gone. You work barefoot. As always, for what you seek can sense the weight of footsteps. You are a leech finder, as some called it, tanned. Your job is as simple as it is repellent, to wade through cold marshes and draw leeches to your flesh. Not with bait, not with tools, with your own blood. While the image of leeches may provoke revulsion now, in Tudor times, they were indispensable to the practice of humoral medicine. Doctors, apothecaries, and barber surgeons believed that illnesses were caused by imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. Of these, blood was most often blamed, and thus bloodletting became the treatment of choice for a range of conditions, from fevers and headaches to melancholy and madness. Enter the leech, used in place of lancets or knives. The European medicinal leech Herudo medicinalist was prized for its perceived ability to draw bad blood in a gentle, measured way. In reality, it simply fed, secreting an anticoagulant in its saliva that kept blood flowing long after it detached. In cities like London, York, and Canterbury, leeches were purchased in bulk by surgeons, barbers, and elite physicians, but they didn't come from city streets. They came from the marshlands, the fens, and the shallow pools of rural England, places damp, silent, and teeming with life. And those who harvested them were almost always poor, unskilled, and desperate. The nature of the work, the tools of the leech collector were rudimentary: a jar or wooden tub, a stick for balance, and perhaps a scrap of cloth to bind wounds afterward. Most worked barefoot or with thin rags tied around the legs to allow the leeches better access. Collectors would wade slowly into boggy waters, standing still for long minutes, sometimes half an hour, waiting for the motion-sensitive leeches to detect warmth and movement. When the creatures latched onto the legs, the collector would wait until several had begun to feed, before gently removing them and placing them into containers lined with damp moss or leaves. The more leeches that fed, the better the catch. This was no mere inconvenience. Each feeding could last 20 to 40 minutes, and the anticoagulant left wounds bleeding for hours afterward. Some collectors carried cloths soaked in ash or salt to stop the bleeding, but often they simply let it run. Injuries were common, so too were infections. Repeated exposure to standing water, open wounds, and cold temperatures led to skin ulcers, persistent anemia, and chronic illness. Many collectors were malnourished to begin with. The additional blood loss, especially in winter, could lead to fainting or collapse. Some collected in pairs to help each other should one pass out. Others worked alone in Lincolnshire and the Somerset levels. The job was often passed down through families. Children as young as 10 were sent into the waters, their smaller bodies considered more appealing to leeches. Women, too, played a large role, especially in fen communities. Though rarely mentioned in official records, a note from a Tudor herbalist in 1549 reads, "The leeches brought from the marshes of Ely are strong and large. The women who bring them oft bleed at the feet, yet do not complain, as they are paid in bread." Where they sold their wares, leech collectors were not independent traders in most cases. They sold their harvests to traveling apothecaries, urban leechmongers, or directly to barber surgeons, who kept the creatures in large earthen jars until needed. A good leech could sell for 1 to 2 pence apiece in cities, a small fortune, relatively speaking, when many day laborers earned 4 to 6 pence a day. But the collectors only received a fraction of that. Most were paid by volume or by count. Prices fluctuated with the season. In winter, when leeches were harder to find, prices rose, but the waters were freezing, and many collectors refused to wade in. Still, some did, and there was competition not just from other humans, but from ducks, eels, and fish that also fed on leeches, and from overharvesting, which began to reduce populations even by the late 1500s. An ordinance issued in Kent in 1577 warned, "Let not the fen be drained of its black worms to the point of emptiness. The surgeon must not want for them, but nor shall the fen be ruined by haste." It was a rare moment of ecological awareness in an age more concerned with immediate utility. The social status of a leech collectors lived at the bottom rungs of society. They were not part of any guild, had no legal protections, and often weren't considered tradespeople at all. They were seen as unpleasant necessities like gong farmers or rat catchers. In urban areas, they were sometimes treated with open disgust. In one 1560 account from London, a collector attempting to sell leeches was refused entry to a barber shop and accused of spreading marsh miasma. He was later fined for disorderly conduct after trying to trade leeches outside a cathedral. Yet despite their low status, their product was sought by the highest in society. King Henry VIII's personal physician is known to have employed leech therapy on the monarch at least twice, and court records from Edward VI's reign mention the delivery of leech jars from Cambridge fens for use at Whitehall. Thus, the leech collector lived in a strange paradiddle, avoided and underpaid, yet feeding a practice central to medicine. From peasant huts to royal chambers, seasonal realities and physical risks, leeches hibernate in colder months, making winter collection nearly impossible without risk of hypothermia or worse. Yet winter was also when many people fell ill, leading to increased demand and greater pressure on collectors. Some attempted to store leeches year-round, keeping them in cool, moist containers in root cellars or basements, but without fresh water and feeding. Many died. Others, when not hungry, refused to bite at all, rendering them useless. There were also legal dangers. The collection of leeches from certain abbey lands or noble estates could result in punishment. In Norfolk, one man was accused of trespassing for leech harvest on a monastic bog in 1542. He was whipped publicly and banned from market sales. And then there was the problem of fakes. Unscrupulous collectors sometimes sold horse leeches or non-blood-sucking species, passing them off as medicinal. These imposters did not feed effectively and were difficult to distinguish once bottled. Apothecaries complained, but enforcement was difficult. Thus the trade was precarious, unsanitary, and dangerous, and yet essential. But did the leech collectors believe in the efficacy of the creatures they harvested? Did they ever use them for themselves? Or were they merely the tools of the privileged, gathered by hands too poor to access the very medicine they supplied? Blood, belief, and the business of biting the Tudor world was, in many ways, held together by belief. In monarchs appointed by God, belief in celestial influences on the body, and belief in leeches as agents of balance. But for the leech collectors, belief was a luxury. Their work was shaped less by medical theory and more by survival. They did not concern themselves with humoral imbalances, nor with whether the physician's diagrams of bodily fluids were accurate. They knew only that these creatures were wanted and that their own blood was the price. Thus we return to their muddy paths. We find a trade that had begun to shift from folk collection to organized commerce, with growing demand from both learned medical men and common apothecaries. But while cities began to formalize medicine with licensing and apprenticeship, the leech finder remained outside the system, a rural gatherer, unlicensed, unprotected, and unseen. Let us now explore how this strange ecosystem worked, how leeches were handled, sold, stored, and used not just in theory, but in the messy, oozing details of actual practice. Leech handling and storage. Care for the uncaring ones pulled from the leg. A leech had to be treated with care. Perudo medicinalis was a hardy species, but it would not survive long if dried out or left in a sealed jar without moisture. Collectors placed them into moss-lined clay pots filled with marsh water or well water. Moss served to keep the leeches damp and also helped them hide, making the containers squirm unpredictably when opened. Apothecaries and surgeons preferred leeches that had not fed recently. A bloated leech already filled with blood would be lethargic and unlikely to bite again soon. To force feeding, some practitioners would poke or nick the leech to provoke activity, others simply waited. Leeches were stored in leech jars, usually ceramic or pewter, kept cool and away from direct sunlight. Apothecaries in London sometimes suspended them in hanging cages near wells or basement. Storooms.1 Urban Apothecaries Ledger from 1571 notes. Jar of 30 blackworms received from fens. 5 were sluggish, 10 fed eagerly, 2 escaped. They often did escape. Leeches could slither from cracked jars, especially when lids were poorly sealed. More than one herbalist's apprentice found their sleeping quarters unexpectedly crawling with small black blood-seeking creatures. Some more dubious sellers attempted to revive sluggish leeches with saltwater rinses or even pricking them with pins, unethical practices that often killed the leech or made it ineffective. True leech finders knew better. They understood, through experience if not education, that the creatures had rhythms: rest, feed, rest again, force them, and they simply died. The medical moment: how leeches were used in actual use. Leeches were applied directly to the skin of the patient, often to temples, forearms, behind the ears, or the neck. Surgeons used them when veins were difficult to open, or on delicate areas where cutting might be dangerous. For the wealthy, leeches were sometimes a fashionable treatment, a mark of refinement, to be bled gently rather than gashed. The process was oddly theatrical. The patient reclined. The apothecary selected a particularly active leech, sometimes using a silver spoon to guide it to the desired site. Once attached, it would feed for 20 to 40 minutes, swelling in size as it gorged on blood. A common problem was leech refusal. If a leech would not bite, the practitioner might try warming the patient's skin or applying a drop of milk to entice it. In rare cases, leeches were incised slightly to stimulate feeding, a dangerous and messy workaround. After feeding, the leech was removed either by letting it detach naturally, or more often by applying salt, which made the creature release its bite in pain. However, this frequently killed the leech, rendering it unusable again. Thus, even though leeches could theoretically be reused, most urban practitioners prefer to order new batches regularly, sustaining the trade of the rural collectors. The profits and perils of a growing market. By the mid-1500s, leeches were no longer a novelty, they were a commodity. Apothecaries stocked them beside herbs, mercury salves, and dried toad powder. Barber surgeons kept them in jars on their counters. Physicians recommended their use in published pamphlets, often citing Hippocrates or Galen, and with this rising demand came competition and fraud. Markets in London, Oxford, and Norwich saw sellers many unlicensed hawking jars of fresh fen worms. Some were genuine, others had gathered non-medicinal species or kept them too long without water. The result: dead leeches, or worse, infections from improper use. The Crown took notice. In 1578, a proclamation from Elizabeth I's Privy Council warned, "Let no apothecary vend bloodworms not fit for human service, nor may collectors trespass upon the sacred grounds of our lands." This mix of market control and moral warning was typical of the Tudor state. They did not regulate leech collectors directly, but they regulated who could sell leeches in the city. Still, the collectors themselves remained on the outside. They were sometimes cheated by middlemen. A collector might deliver a jar of leeches for an agreed price, only to be told that half had died or were unfit. With no contract or guild support, they could do nothing. Some collectors tried to sell directly to surgeons, but were often refused at the door or paid less. And then there were religious suspicions. In rural villages, leech collection was sometimes linked to folk healing. A woman who gathered leeches might also brew herbs, deliver babies, or whisper prayers over the sick. If the cure failed or simply frightened someone, accusations followed. In 1582, a woman named Marjorie Toil in East Anglia was accused of using leeches to draw forth the devil's humor from a child's neck. No leeches were found, but her jars of moss and marsh water were smashed, and she was driven from the village. Thus, the collectors occupied a narrow space between science and suspicion. Their product was central to elite medicine, but their methods, rooted in mud and instinct, made them suspect to both church and town. A bleeding profession, it is worth remembering that while leeches were used to bleed others, the collectors often bled themselves daily. A particularly fruitful morning might leave a worker with a dozen open wounds, oozing for hours afterward. These cuts left untreated led to long-term consequences: chronic anemia from repeated blood loss, infections from stagnant water or animal waste. Permanent scarring, particularly on the legs and feet. Joint pain and skin diseases from prolonged exposure to marsh conditions. There were no pensions, no protection. A collector too weak to wade simply went hungry. Some tried other work: cutting, fishing, waterfowl hunting, but few left the trade entirely. It was seasonal, brutal, and thankless, but for many it was the only work available, and while their product entered royal halls, court chambers, and surgeons' kits, the hands that delivered it remained nameless, covered in scabs and mud. So we ask, did the rise of medical science ever make space for those who bled for it? Or were they simply replaced by progress, by imports, by new machines, and forgotten as soon as they stopped walking into the marsh? The bleeding ends, decline, displacement, and the vanishing of a trade. By the dawn of the 17th century, England was changing. The Elizabethan age gave way to Jacobean uncertainties. New ideas flowed from universities and foreign cities, new charts of the body, new understandings of disease, and slowly, new doubts about old remedies. Among those remedies, the leech remained prominent, but increasingly it found itself competing with powders, syrups, and metal instruments. The creatures that had once symbolized gentle healing began to feel outdated. Yet, even as the medical world moved forward, the lives of leech collectors remained stubbornly rooted in the mud, unchanged, unacknowledged, and unremarked upon. They continued to walk barefoot into cold marshes, arms and legs exposed, seeking blood drinkers that would later be used to drain others. But now, for the first time, they faced a threat not just from nature, but from medicine itself. The fall of the humoral theory, which had sustained leech usage for centuries, began to decline as European medicine turned toward anatomy, chemistry, and experiment. The rise of figures like William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood in 1628, undermined the idea that illness came from vague excesses of bodily fluids. Though this didn't immediately end bloodletting, and certainly not the use of leeches, it started a slow erosion of their dominance. University-trained physicians, especially in London and Cambridge, began to question the therapeutic value of blood removal. Surgeons, always more practical than philosophical, began to favor steel instruments for bleeding, fleams, lancets, and these tools were faster, cleaner, and didn't crawl away or die after use. The leech, once a symbol of medicinal precision, became messy, that an leech collector, never truly welcomed, now found himself less needed. Imports and industrial pressure. Another shift came not from doctors, but from merchants. In the late 1600s and into the early 18th century, England began importing leeches from abroad, especially from Sweden, Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire, where vast wetlands teemed with more abundant populations. These imported leeches were larger, cheaper, and more easily preserved during transport thanks to improvements in shipping and storage. Apothecaries began to favor them, citing their size and more vigorous appetite. One London apothecary wrote in 1703, "The Danube worm feeds more swiftly and leaves less festering. The English marsh leeches are sluggish, dull, and of poor yield." This was, of course, not entirely fair, but it reflected a growing trend. English leech collectors could not compete with foreign supply lines in scale. Their income fell. Middlemen stopped purchasing. By the early 1700s, collectors who once earned 6 to 8 pence a day now found it difficult to earn half that. Some turned to fishing or reed cutting, others to moss gathering or bird snaring. Still others left the wetlands entirely, moving toward cities in search of factory work. Few succeeded. The ecology collapses by the 18th century. Overharvesting and land drainage further reduced native leech populations in England. Vast portions of the East Anglian fens and Somerset levels were drained for agriculture, driven by rising demand for arable land and pushed along by wealthy landowners. This not only eliminated leech habitats but displaced entire marshland communities: fishermen, thatchers, peat cutters, and yes, leech collectors. A 1721 report from a fenland parish in Cambridgeshire noted, "The women and children who once caught leeches now labor in flax, or not at all. The pools have dried, the worms have vanished." By the mid-18th century, British leech collection had all but vanished as a rural trade. What remained was either imported or gathered in small localized batches, usually for folk use rather than formal medicine. And as demand declined, so too did the memory of those who had supplied it. Echoes in the 19th century. Ironically, the 19th century brought a brief and frenzied resurgence in leech demand, particularly in France and Britain. This was driven by the strange medical fads of the Romantic period, where leeches were applied in vast quantities for everything from bruises to nervous disorders. In France alone, over 30 million leeches were used annually by the 1830s. Britain followed suit. Large-scale leech farms were established, but these were commercial operations, far removed from barefoot wading and personal bloodletting. The rural leech collector of Tudor England had no place in this industrialized model. Some surviving marsh communities briefly returned to collection, lured by high prices, but this resurgence was short-lived. By the 1850s, demand collapsed again, as bloodletting fell permanently out of favor in professional medicine, a profession unmourned. No memorial was ever built for the leech finders of Tudor England. No guild crest, no burial markers, no historical plaques along the fen paths. Their names, what few survive, are written in court rolls, poorhouse ledgers, and the occasional scribble in an apothecary's notebook. But perhaps that is fitting. lived in the spaces between land and water, between medicine and superstition, between life and leech. They did not leave books, they did not leave wealth. They left only a quiet footprint in the mud, washed away with the next high tide, and yet they played a role in the shaping of medical history, a role that was bloody, painful, and brief. They carried jars to city gates, stood silently as barbers took their wares, and limped back into the marsh for more. So the next time you see a leech, whether in a museum display, a book illustration, or a passing memory, remember that someone once stood very still in the cold water, offering up their skin so that others might be healed. And then ask yourself, how many nameless people, in the history of science and medicine, have bled unseen so that progress could feed? The night's quiet feet, lighting the way in Tokugawa, Japan. The city is still wrapped in the soft hush of evening. The last of the merchants have shuttered their stalls, and the smell of grilled fish and miso drifts faintly in the air. Along the narrow lanes of Edo, the city that would one day become Tokyo, silhouettes move slowly under the dim glow of flickering paper lanterns. But one figure walks not to reach a destination, but to create light itself. He carries a long pole with a swinging lantern, sometimes two. His robe is worn at the knees, his feet wrapped in straw sandals. He does not speak unless spoken to, and even then, only softly. He is a chochimuchi, a lantern bearer, and his work is both essential and invisible. He is the light, and yet rarely seen. A city lit by flaming Tokugawa period Japan, 1603 to 1868, Edo was one of the largest cities in the world. By the 18th century, its population approached 1 million people, an urban center of remarkable order, dense wooden construction, and rigid class structure. And yet, for all its organization, Edo was dark. Gaslight had not arrived. Oil was expensive, and fire, especially in a city of wood and paper, was feared more than almost anything else. Nighttime illumination, therefore, was a controlled and cautious affair. Citizens relied on small lanterns, chochin, often no brighter than a candle, to light their way after sunset. Only wealthier individuals and establishments had access to more elaborate lighting, and when they needed to move through the streets, whether to attend an event, visit another home, or return from the bath, they did not walk alone. They hired a lantern bearer. The role of the Chochin Machi's job was deceptively simple: carry the lantern and guide the way. But in a city as stratified and regulated as Edo, this task came with unspoken responsibilities, precise etiquette, and real dangers. Lantern bearers were not samurai, nor merchants, nor servants in the traditional household sense. They were part of Edo's low-ranking urban labor-class individuals who survived by performing single-purpose tasks, often hired per job, per evening, or per route. They were commonly employed by wealthy merchants returning from nighttime dealings, couriers, or officials traveling between districts, geisha or courtesans needing discreet escorts, temple-goers, especially elderly patrons, yakuza, and gamblers who preferred to travel without notice, yet not without light. A lantern bearer might be on call, outside bathhouses, inns, or theater districts. Others were retained by the same employer night after night. In some neighborhoods, they formed loose associations and formal brotherhoods that divided the city into zones and ensured no one encroached on another's route. The pole they carried could extend several feet, raising the lantern above head, height to cast a wider beam. The chochin itself was typically made from oiled paper stretched over a bamboo frame. The inner light came from a small oil lamp or candle, both of which required constant attention to avoid snuffing or spills. And then, of course, there was the wind. Even a light breeze could extinguish a chochin. Lantern bearers became adept at using their sleeves, or their own bodies, as wind breaks in bad weather. They carried hooded lanterns or leaned their bodies, forward walking bent to protect the flame. They also had to read the streets. Edo's lanes were tight, winding, and often unmarked. A lantern bearer needed to know every shortcut, slope, and footbridge. They anticipated puddles, uneven stones, and clusters of street dogs. They avoided guard posts or patrols during certain hours, especially if their client wanted discretion nightly. Dangers and daily struggles despite the quiet image of their task. The lantern bearer's life was not peaceful. They were paid poorly, often a single 1 copper coin per job, barely enough for a bowl of rice. Most owned only one robe, patched and fraying, and slept in communal lodgings with other single men, such as bathhouse workers, firewood haulers, and errand boys. The work was seasonal. In summer, the nights were longer and the streets busier. In winter, the cold made night walks shorter and more treacherous. Snow could collapse a chochin. Ice could send bearer and lantern tumbling into the canal. Then there was the danger of fire. A dropped lantern could ignite thatched roofing or paper screens. Lantern bearers were held liable in some cases, and rumors of accidental fires could ruin a man's reputation. They were careful obsessively, so often stopping to relight or adjust the flame before continuing. Records from the period mention fines for careless flame bearing. One note from a town magistrate reads, "A bearer did set fire to the outer eaves of a merchant's home. Though swiftly extinguished, he was fined to Mon and dismissed from the district." There were also thieves and rowdies. While Edo was policed by the Makabujo and neighborhood groups, the darker streets around entertainment quarters were less secure. Lantern bearers sometimes walked armed with a small stick, a rock, or simply the confidence of knowing local toughs. Most relied on anonymity and respect. They were seen as poor but necessary. Serving the silent city, what made the lantern bearer's role unique was how invisible he was meant to be. He did not speak unless asked. He walked ahead, lighting the path but never joining the conversation. His job was to remain present but unnoticed, a human street lamp whose value was judged by his silence and steadiness. Some of his clients appreciated him. A few gave tips, extra coin, or the rare bun. Others, particularly drunken merchants or overindulged sons of samurai, treated him like furniture. There are accounts of lantern bearers being struck for walking too slowly or accused of misguiding a guest in the dark. Still, the bearer showed up the next night, because to not show up meant someone else might claim his route. And routes were precious. They were the difference between a meal and none, between a cold floor and a dry one. In art, the Chochin Mochi appears occasionally, always small, always silent. In ukiyo-e prints, he is seen hunched behind a brothel curtain, or leading a geisha through the mist. He is there, but not part of the story, always holding the light, never in it. The ritual of the flamesome bearers added small rituals to their nights, a whispered prayer before lighting the flame, a nod toward the moon at certain street corners, or a habit of walking only on the left side of bridges. These superstitions were part self-preservation, part routine. In times of festival, their work increased. During Bon festivals, New Year's nights, and lantern viewing gatherings, bearers were hired in greater numbers to escort revelers home. These rare nights of joy brought welcome and comfort, also the risk of drunk clients, crowded lanes, and higher chance of fire. No matter the night, the Chochin Mochi was always there, between dusk and dawn, walking softly, swinging his light, like a pendulum of survival. But what age shadows and shifts? The slow fade of the Chochin Machiba in the middle of the 19th century. The world outside Japan was changing rapidly. Western nations surged forward with industrial might, lighting their streets with gas lamps, propelling steamships across oceans, and wiring up telegraph lines that carried news faster than any courier could run. Inside Japan, the winds of change rustled more quietly, like paper lanterns swaying before a storm. And at the heart of the old city of Edo, the Chochin Mochi still walked, still barefoot, still quiet, still carrying a flickering light through the same narrow lanes he had known for decades. But his world was shrinking. Time's silent pressure, though, the Edo period is remembered for its stability. It was also an era of tight control and creeping transformation. The rigid class system, samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants held steady. But cracks had begun to form by the early 1800s. Merchant wealth outstripped samurai stipends. Urban laborers organized themselves into informal trade networks. And lantern bearers, like many others, began to feel the squeeze. The Chochin Machi's world revolved around personal contact and trust. His work relied on people needing him, wealthy individuals, cautious travelers, or regular clients who depended on his steady light through the city's nighttime labyrinth. But as neighborhoods became more organized and lantern posts were set up at intersections by town associations, particularly in affluent districts, the need for a personal light began to diminish. Wealthier clients built private walkways or began traveling by palanquin with their own attendants. Others simply learned the streets better. Meanwhile, younger laborers were drawn to newer, more lucrative jobs: delivery runners, haikyoku, bathhouse, fire stokers, apprentice bookbinders, or ferry pullmen along the Sumida River. These roles offered a bit more money, and sometimes even room and board. The Chochin Mochi remained, but its presence began to feel increasingly old-fashioned. Even quaint, encroaching fire, and the risk of obsolescence for a job built around fire. The risk of fire was ever-present, and as Edo's population grew, so too did the dangers of a dropped lantern. Edo was infamous for its frequent fires, known as Edo no Hana, the flowers of Edo. These were not small blazes. Whole districts could be lost in a single night. Wooden homes built wall to wall, with roofs of thatch or thin tiles, offered little protection. City ordinances tightened. Some districts banned open flames after dark unless attended by a registered servant. Lantern bearers found themselves hemmed in by law, unable to walk certain streets, required to carry permits or wear identifying sashes, and occasionally detained by patrolmen if their clients were seen as suspicious. A night log from an Edo Firewatch group Hishi from 1847 mentions Tomochi detained at the Western Bridge for failing to show client papers. One dismissed. The other had broken flame. Cup, no fine issued. Such restrictions made the job harder. Clients were hesitant to hire bearers who might bring unwanted attention. The bearers adapted, using smaller flames, trimming their routes, avoiding checkpoints. Still, their numbers dwindled. The Meiji shift, gaslight, street lamps, and foreign fire in 1853. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan with black ships and a demand: open your ports. The following decades would bring the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate. the opening of the country to international trade, and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. With it came technology and light. Gas lamps, imported from the West, were installed in parts of Tokyo, formerly Edo, starting in the 1870s. At first they were a novelty. They lined main thoroughfares, government zones, and treaty ports. But by the 1880s, gas lighting had spread to more commercial streets, and electric lighting soon followed. A government notice in 1874 announced lantern posts to be removed. From outer Ginza, gaslight sufficient. Bearers not required in that district after ninth moon. The Chochin Mochi had no answer to this. Their job had always been built on a simple premise: where there is darkness, light must be carried. Now, the city no longer darkened the way it once had. The bearers who remained were relegated to rural towns, festival services, or private hire by elderly patrons. In some cases, they became night guards, patrolling the outer gates of merchant warehouses. A few transitioned into messenger work, carrying notes or parcels in the evenings. But the skill of holding a flame, of walking just so, of knowing the wind, of staying unseen no longer mattered. One Chochin Mochi named Gore is briefly mentioned in an 1886 journal from a Meiji writer. He lights the way from the sake shop to the old print house. They say he has walked that road since the last shogun ruled. His flame is slower now. There are no further records of him, ghosts of light, by the turn of the 20th century. The Chochin Mochi had vanished from Tokyo. Their lanterns were sold to antique shops, their poles repurposed. The few who still remembered them spoke of soft footsteps and paper flickers and fog of memory, more poetic than real. And yet, the job left traces. In rural Japan, festivals still feature processions of lantern bearers, echoing the nightly walks of old Edo. In Kabuki theater, the Chochin Mochi occasionally appears as a background figure swinging his pole, guiding a noble or villain through the night. And in countless ukiyo-e woodblock prints, there are hunched figures behind the central characters, always holding the light, always unseen. The quiet question: the Chochin Mochi were never written into textbooks. Their names are lost, their daily steps uncounted. But for over 2 centuries, they were the only thing between the people of Edo and the dark. And now we ask, when the light arrived and their job disappeared, did anyone pause to miss them? Did anyone look down a quiet street, once walked by a man with a lantern, and feel the absence of that gentle glow that followed without question, then faded without complaint? Carving silence, the birth of a forgotten art. The wind howls across the frozen deck. Ice clings to the rigging, and the smell of whale oil saturates every board and coat. You are deep in Arctic waters, perhaps off the coast of Greenland or Baffin Bay. The sun never fully rises. The days are pale. The nights are endless. There is nothing to do but wait for ice to clear, for whales to surface, for death or luck to choose their moment. In the waiting, some men carve a piece of bone, a shard of tooth, the dull end of a blubber hook. These become the canvas. A stolen hour by lantern light, a pocket knife, and a practiced hand transform trash into art. These are the scrimshanders, the bone carvers of the frozen sea. They were not artists by training. They were whalers by trade, rough men, underpaid, half-frozen, confined to creaking ships for months on end. But in the long hours between hunts, while the wind screamed and the decks iced over, they created, they etched, they engraved, and in doing so they left behind a whispered history, told in ivory and soot. The harsh world of Arctic whaling, scrimshaw, as we now call it, was born of necessity, boredom, and a surplus of whale bones, specifically sperm whale, teeth, walrus tusks, and the baleen plates of right and bowhead whales. During the peak of Arctic whaling, roughly the late 18th to mid-19th centuries, hundreds of British, Dutch, American, and French ships hunted the Arctic seas, following the seasonal movements of whales. Aboard each ship were 30 to 50 men, packed into damped quarters, sleeping in shifts, surrounded by blood, brine, and blubber. They worked in deadly conditions. Whale hunting was physically brutal and emotionally numbing. Crews pursued enormous creatures in small open boats, harpooned them by hand, and clung to ropes as the dying animals thrashed and rolled in freezing seas. Once killed, the whale was processed, flensed on deck, stripped of its fat, and rendered in great cauldrons called tryworks. Bones and teeth, often discarded, too heavy to bring home. But some stayed behind, souvenirs of violence, and tools for creativity. The scrimshander's tools and methods. The word scrimshaw may derive from a Dutch term meaning idle pastime or to waste time. And that's exactly how it began. Idle carving to pass the long months between hunts. The process was both primitive and careful. Materials. Sperm whale teeth were the preferred, medium dense, white and smooth. Baleen was flexible and black. Walrus tusks, when available, offered a whiter, finer grain. Tools. Most scrimshanders used sail needles, awls, or jackknives. Others sharpened iron nails or whittled wooden styluses. Inking once carved. The incisions were filled with soot, oil residue, or lampblack, then rubbed clean to reveal the design. Later, ink and pigment were used. Subjects varied. Ships at sea, meticulously detailed with rigging and sails, mermaids, anchors, and compass roses, reflecting sailor superstitions. Women's portraits often idealized, sometimes imagined. Scenes from home, such as cottages, lighthouses, and horses. Biblical verses, patriotic slogans, or poetry, etched in looping script. Each piece was deeply personal. Most were unsigned. Some were gifts for sweethearts. Others were traded or sold in ports. A few were made simply to prove a man's skill with a knife. One Weir's journal from 1832, found aboard a wrecked vessel near Greenland, includes the line, "Stevens carved a whale tooth for Sarah's wedding, took him 5 nights, burned a finger on the lamp, worth it." The time involved in making a scrimshaw piece could range from hours to weeks, depending on the complexity and weather conditions. Some were tiny pendants, sewing bobbins, or pipe tappers. Others were grand canes, boxes, or full panoramic scenes etched across a row of teeth. Life aboard. The cold, the hunger, the waiting to understand scrimshaw. You must understand what it meant to be idle at sea, not in luxury, but in cold desperation. Arctic voyages could last 18 months or more, depending on the ice. Men lived in quarters barely high enough to stand in, often damp with seawater or reeking of rancid oil. Food was salted meat, chips, biscuit, and molasses. Scurvy was common. Teeth fell out, skin split open in the cold. When not actively hunting or rendering blubber, time hung heavy. There were no books, no distractions. Just sea, sky, and the creaking wood. Many sailors turned to crafts. Some made model ships or carved spoons. But scrimshaw became popular because of its intimacy, its portability. A whale tooth fit in a coat pocket. A needle could be hidden from the first mate. A soot pot was always nearby. It gave men something to focus on, something beyond the noise and blood of the hunt, and more importantly, it gave them a voice, however quiet. A ship's social order. It is easy to romanticize the scrimshander as a lone artist, but aboard ship, every man had a role. Most scrimshaw was made by ordinary crewmen, not officers. But even in the brutal democracy of the sea, there was a hierarchy. Officers might commission pieces from skilled carvers offering extra rum or tobacco in return. Talented scrimshanders became known, if not famous, on some vessels. Their work was bartered like currency. A well-carved pipe lid might earn better rations. A portrait of a captain's wife could mean leniency on watch, but not everyone approved. Some captains saw scrimshaw as a distraction. Idle hands, they believed, invited sloppiness. Fights broke out when tools were stolen. Jealousy grew if one man was praised too much. And there was always the danger of injury. Carving in cramped spaces, in bad light, with sharp tools. A fragment from an 1821 letter reads, "Jackson cut his thumb to the bone, carving a lass's face. Blood ruined, tooth still, he started again." The line says much. The act of making was itself a kind of madness, a form of devotion amid discomfort. Naming the nameless, very few scrimshanders left their names. Most were illiterate. Their pieces survive in museums and private collections, often labeled anonymous. Circa 1830, one of the few known carvers, Frederick Myrick, signed and dated his works in the 1820s aboard American whaling ships. His scrimshaw was so admired that others forged his signature later. But for every Myrick, there were hundreds of silent hands, carving for no one but themselves or someone waiting on the far shore. The art they created was not meant to last. It was not displayed. It was held, tucked into chests, kissed, worn, thin by pocket lids and time, yet it endures. Pieces of scrimshaw now sit behind glass, testaments not just to whaling, but to how men endured. They were not poets, they were not painters, but with bone and soot they told their stories anyway. And as you run your finger over the grooves of a scrimshaw tooth, some faded sketch of a ship or girl, you are tracing the same line once, carved by a half-frozen hand in the belly of a wooden ship, surrounded by iced fire and silence. But as whaling declined, and the Arctic routes closed, what became of the men who carved these whispers into bone? When the ships no longer sailed, and the whales no longer came, did their art die with their trade, or did it find a way to follow the shore? From blubber decks to display cases, the changing fate of scrimshaw. The wind has shifted. The sails are slack. The sea groans beneath a ship whose hull is blackened with whale oil and frost. On deck, the try-works are cold. The last fire has burned low. The final cauldron's emptied. The season is over, or nearly so. There'll be no more kills, no more blood-soaked planks. Below, in the dark of the crew's quarters, a man files the tip of a whale tooth smooth. He has just a few days to finish what he's been carving for months. It's a portrait, though the woman he's etched may be half to imagine. He's never said her name aloud. He wipes the dust from the ivory. He rubs it clean with oil and soot. No one watches him, no one thanks him, but it doesn't matter. She's done now. She's real, and soon he'll be ashore again. This was how it often went. Scrimshaw, born in motion, finished in silence, passed into hands that never knew the cold from which it came. But as whaling changed, and then disappeared, what happened to the men who carved the sea into bone? The decline of the whaling trade by the mid-19th century. The global whaling industry began to falter. Several factors converged. Petroleum and kerosene emerged as replacements for whale oil and laps. Overfishing led to a drastic drop in whale populations. especially sperm whales, changing public sentiment, particularly in the latter half of the century, began to view whaling as barbaric rather than noble. Steam-powered ships replaced wind-driven vessels, making long whaling voyages less economically viable. In the United States, particularly New England and in parts of Britain and the Netherlands, the grand fleets of whalers were gradually sold, scrapped, or turned to freight. With the ships went the jobs, and with the jobs the scrimshanders. Some tried to adapt. A few joined merchant fleets, carrying cargo rather than blubber. Others took up shore-based work, fishing, ship repair, or odd labor in port towns. But many struggled. These were men, trained in hard labor, long months at sea, and carving to pass a time not suited for urban trades, and the art they left behind. At first it was simply forgotten. Scrimshaw as sentimental keepsake before it became collectible. Scrimshaw was personal objects kept in drawers, wrapped in cloth, or given as tokens of affection. Sailors brought it home for wives, sisters, sweethearts, some carved knitting, needles or sewing boxes, with delicate etchings hidden inside. Others made pipe holders, combs, or pendants. In some coastal villages, particularly in Massachusetts and parts of coastal Yorkshire, these items remained within families for generations. They were not considered art, just odd, functional trinkets with a strange pedigree. Many were stored in attics or forgotten in trunks. Only in the late 19th and early 20th century did collectors begin to take interest. From utility to collectible by the 1880s and 1890s, antiquarians, early collectors of maritime lore, began to seek out Scrimshaw. At first, they prized its naive charm, the untrained artistry, the sailor's hand, the imperfections that made each piece unique. As more items surfaced, museums began to take notice. In 1907, the Peabody Museum in Salem, Massachusetts held one of the first formal exhibits of Scrimshaw as historical artifact. The labels were plain: tooth carved by unknown sailor, New York Sensi whalebone ditty box, provenance uncertain. Still, the pieces drew attention. In the years that followed, Scrimshaw passed from ship to shelf, from cold hands on a deck to warm light in a cabinet. Collectors assigned names to styles, guessed at origins, and occasionally attributed unsigned works to known artists like Frederick Myrick or Nathaniel Sylvester Finney, names now associated with a craft that never once sought fame. But as values rose, forgeries began to appear. Some modern carvers mimicked the old styles, staining teeth with tea and soot to age them artificially. The line between authentic and imitation blurred. Still, true collectors and especially descendants of whalers valued the original works not just for their etching, but for what they represented: a moment of quiet human expression, carved in a place where no such thing should have existed. Cultural legacy and the lost hand. Scrimshaw found its way into art history, maritime museums, and popular nostalgia. By the mid-20th century, it was seen as a symbol of whaling heritage, a relic of the age of sail. But its makers remained largely anonymous. Most scrimshanders never saw their work again after giving it away. Their names went unrecorded, and as they died, many in poverty or obscurity, the craft shifted from living tradition to historic curiosity. Some scholars in the 1950s and 60s interviewed the last descendants of whalers in Nantucket, New Bedford, and Hull. These elderly men and women remembered uncles or grandfathers who carved in their spare time. They could still point out a tooth and say, that was his, but they rarely knew more. There was no school of Scrimshaw, no guild. It was not taught. It was done, and then it was over. One scholar wrote in 1961, "It is an art of whispers, not proclamations. There is no lineage, only echoes." Repurposed art. Scrimshaw after the sea. Some former scrimshanders tried to continue carving ashore, particularly in the whaling towns of decline. But the materials were harder to find. Whale teeth were no longer waste, but regulated or expensive. Instead, carvers turned to oxbone or ivory when it was still legal, wood, especially driftwood or reclaimed ship timber, synthetic replicas, though rarely with the same texture. The pieces they made now were for tourists. Visitors to Cape Cod or the Orkneys bought them as curios. The carvers adapted their styles, often etching lighthouses, lobsters, or sailing ships designed more for mass appeal than personal memory. Some viewed this as the commercial death of Scrimshaw. Others saw it as a final breath, proof that something of the art still survived, even if changed. Preservation and controversy. Today, Scrimshaw is protected, in part, by laws surrounding endangered species. The trade of new ivory or whale products is highly restricted under international agreements like CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Museums, collectors, and historians now work to preserve historic Scrimshaw while ensuring no new harm comes from the craft. Some contemporary artists continue to carve, but using ethical alternatives such as resin, bone, or togwa nut, known as vegetable ivory. Still, the debate continues. How do we honor an art form born from violence? Can the beauty of a carved whale tooth ever be separated from the creature it came from, or does each stroke of the blade whisper the memory of something lost? And what of the scrimshanders themselves, the men who made art not for money, nor for fame, but simply to survive? The cold, their hands are gone, their tools rusted, their ships rotted at sea, but the things they left behind still speak, still whisper, still wait to be understood. Last carvings, memory, meaning, and the sea's quiet legacy. The ocean forgets, the ice melts, the bones bleach, but a scrimshaw tooth, a single curved relic of one man's time aboard a frozen ship, can outlast all of that if it does not crack. It can endure for centuries, and in that soft ivory hue, stained by soot and oil, lie histories far too fragile for official records, the etched silhouette of a lover who never wrote back, the rigging lines of a whaling bark long since wrecked, the gentle curve of a coastline once glimpsed through a snowstorm. These were not grand gestures, nor commissioned portraits. They were the most modest acts of human remembrance, quiet scratches in bone from men who spent half their lives surrounded by death and silence. But in the end, that's why they matter. The scrimshawed body of the sea scrimshaw isn't simply about art, it's about consequence. Each piece carries with it the weight of its source. The whale, the artist, never carved wood or canvas. He carved tooth, bone, and ballyneech pulled from an animal that took hours to die. Its body hauled onto a ship's deck for profit and provision. In this way, every piece of scrimshaw is a kind of memorial, whether the artist intended it or not. Some whalers understood this. A rare few pieces show whale eyes, detailed and sorrowful, or scenes of hunts gone wrong, where boats are upturned and men flail in the sea. These are not romantic or boastful, they are honest, perhaps even regretful. Other works are deeply human, an anchor beside a heart, initials inside a compass, or a woman's name below the stern of a ship. These works suggest longing, attachment, and survival, not triumph. And they remind us that while the whale was the harpooner, he was also a man who missed home. In a sailor's pocket, a carved tooth was both trophy and token. It symbolized what he had done, but also what he hoped for: peace, return, a warm fire, and dry hands. Scrimshaw in the modern imagination today, scrimshaw is often separated from its context. It appears behind glass, under soft lighting, accompanied by placards that give approximate dates and imagined names. And yet, to look closely at it, to really look, is to feel the passage of cold nights and sharp blades. Museums now approach scrimshaw with both reverence and caution. They recognize its craftsmanship, but also the ecological and ethical shadow behind it. Some have added disclaimers or new signage, reminding viewers that each piece once belonged to a hunted creature. Still, scrimshaw continues to fascinate, perhaps because it defies categorization. It is a folk art, but also a product of industrial slaughter, a personal expression, but made by men denied leisure or safety, a cultural relic, yet born from boredom and hardship, a portable legacy yet tied to places, ships, oceans, ice that no longer exist as they once did. It is, in a sense, a ghost of the whales, the ships, and the men who once moved between them. Final days at sea. By the early 20th century, the last of the wooden whaling ships had vanished from most oceans. Steam replaced sail. Factories replaced try-work, and the men who had once filled idle hours with bone carving drifted into history. A handful of old sailors, by then too old to climb rigging or man boats, kept their tools. Some carved ivory-handled canes or decorated walking sticks. Others stopped carving altogether, their hands stiffed, their stories buried in silence. One scrimshander interviewed in 1914 in New Bedford said, "I used to carve to pass the time. Now time just passes." There is no memorial for these men, not as artists, not even as laborers. The ocean does not remember. The ships have all rotted. The whales are fewer now, and wiser, staying deep. Only the carvings remain. What was left behind scrimshaw is not a heroic art. It does not shout. It does not boast. It is quiet, deliberate, and fragile, but in that fragility lies its power. It reminds us that even in the harshest environments, surrounded by danger, cold, and blood, people still try to create beauty. Not because they're told to, not because anyone will see it, but because something inside them insists that to make something lasting from something dying is, somehow, to reclaim a part of themselves. The men who carved scrimshaw were not professional artists, but they were witnesses to a trade, to a way of life, to a disappearing world, and in their carvings, they left behind a question, perhaps unintentional, perhaps whispered in each soft groove and careful line. When all else is gone, when the ship has sunk, the whale has passed, and the name has been lost, what is it that remains, and is that enough? Encased hand fingers and counting souls inside the 19th century census machine. The candle flickers low. The clerk squints through wire-rimmed spectacles, fingers blackened by iron gall ink, lips pursed in faint frustration. His desk is piled high with folded slips of paper, some smudged, some damp, many barely legible. The room is cold. The fire, rationed to save money, has long since died. Still, he works on. Somewhere in that pile is a farmer's name, a widow's age, the number of children in a Yorkshire tenement, a stable boy listed as deaf, a washerwoman marked idiot. Each mark, each squiggle, each faded scroll a life, frozen on paper, waiting to be entered, categorized, and bound into Britain's growing bureaucratic heart. He is an enumeration clerk. His world is not made of battles or speeches or railroad. It is made of dust, ink, and silence. But in the endless tedium of counting, he is building something bigger than he knows. He is building a nation's memory, the birth of a national obsession. The first modern census in Britain took place in 1801, a simple count of heads, prompted by concerns over food supply during the Napoleonic Wars. It recorded only the most basic data, number of people, occupations, and houses. But by 1841, the census had evolved. For the first time, the government wanted names, ages, birthplaces, jobs. They wanted to understand not just how many people lived in Britain, but who they were, where they worked, and how they lived. This marked the beginning of a new era, state-level data collection, driven by growing industrialization, expanding cities, and a political desire to map the nation's soul. And someone had to read, sort, and organize it all. Enter the enumeration clerks. Behind every decennial census was a vast machinery of labor, not just the field enumerators who walked door to door, but the clerks who received the flood of handwritten forms and turned them into legible, standardized entries. Their work was neither celebrated nor widely understood. They operated in unheated offices, many of them temporary, assembled for the months or years surrounding each census. The 1851 census alone employed over 200 clerks in London's Somerset House, all tasked with checking, copying, and sorting the data returned from across England, Scotland, and Wales. Their work was repetitive, mind-numbingly so. Each clerk would open and sort household schedules, often folded and crumpled after weeks of handling, transcribe each entry name, age, relationship to head of household, occupation, birthplace into massive ledgers called enumeration books, flagging consistencies such as suspiciously high ages many claim to be 99, duplicate names, or improbable occupations, correct spelling errors, which were rampant due to low literacy among both the public and field enumerators. They were forbidden from embellishing or interpreting. Their task was not to understand the people, only to record them. The endless columns of life. An enumeration clerk's daily environment was a world of columns and codes. Each page of the ledger might contain 40 households, each with 5 to 12 individuals. The clerks transcribed thousands of these entries by hand, using a narrow-nibbed pen, in a precise hand. Often while seated for 12 to 14 hours at a stretch, mistakes were punished. Sloppiness could lead to rejection of entire sections of a county's return. Supervisors walked the aisles between desks, checking for errors, ensuring no ink, blots, or illegible loops. The ledgers were enormous pages, sometimes over 2 feet wide, heavy enough to bruise. Clerks learned to flip pages without smearing ink, to balance the weight with a thumb, and to rest their wrists just above the margins to avoid staining entries. This physicality, the paper, the ink, the weight, was a defining feature of their work. Today's spreadsheets are cold and digital, but the Victorian census was almost visceral. It smelled of paper and sweat. It creaked with chairs and muttered complaints, and it slowly built the largest demographic record the country had ever seen. Who were the clerks? Enumeration clerks were often young men, literate but not wealthy, sometimes failed students or minor civil servants hoping for a permanent position. Many were paid per entry or by the hour. A few women were hired in later decades, particularly for tasks deemed delicate, like transcribing children's data or reading poor handwriting. Some clerks brought their own pens, others were issued worn quills. The ink froze in winter and bled in summer. Their uniforms were informal but neat. A fraying cravat or missing button might earn a sharp rebuke. They were not considered important. They were easily replaced. And yet, their errors could lead to miscounts in towns, wrong ages recorded, or entire families misnamed. A surviving complaint, letter from a clerk named Edwin H. Toft, dated 1852, reads, "Sir, I must note the ink provided is wholly unsuitable. It congeals in the nib and spoils the entries. I am reprimanded for smudges which are not my doing." No reply was found. Stories between the lines. Though clerks were not meant to reflect on the content of the entries, they could not help noticing the patterns. Entire families of children working in mills by age 10. Dozens of widows in a single poorhouse, aged 70 and up. 6-year-olds listed as new. Whole streets filled with agricultural laborer and nothing else. Sometimes entries came with notes in the margins, usually from enumerators, but occasionally from householders. "My husband is away at sea, returning God willing. Born in Ireland, but not by choice. The baby died before you came. Still count him, please." The clerks, officially forbidden from adding comment, sometimes penciled small marks in the margin, a question mark, a star, a tiny cross. They were not allowed to care, but some did. The system and its machine once entered into the ledgers. The data was passed up the bureaucratic ladder to statisticians, parliamentarians, and reformers. It was used to justify new laws, poorhouse funding, school acts, and urban redevelopment. But the names, the actual people, were forgotten to the state. The census was a tool. Population growth, density maps, workforce tallies, To the clerks, it was a mountain of handwriting. Only a few ever paused to think about what they were really doing, transforming people into numbers. It was, in many ways, a mechanical reduction of life essential, cold and strangely beautiful in its comprehensiveness. A quiet contribution that enumeration clerks of Victorian Britain never earned headlines. They did not invent the census, nor analyze its results, but without them, the modern history of Britain would have no backbone. They were the ones who turned the messy sprawl of a growing empire into a legible portrait to one name, one line at a time. And yet, when the ledgers were bound and the data published, they were dismissed, replaced, or forgotten. Some moved on to better clerical posts, others left for colonies or joined rail companies. A few died still transcribing names. Decades into their anonymous careers, their work lives on, hidden in the margins of archives and ancestry records. But now, as we scan these ledgers online or search for a great-great-grandmother's birthplace, we rarely wonder who wrote this, who sat by lamplight, copying this name with aching fingers and cold feet, and what did he think that quiet evening in 1851, as he turned the page, dipped his pen, and counted the next soul. The tedium of empire cataloguing a nation in motion of the year is 1871. Britain sits astride the globe like a colossus. Its factories roar, its ships stretch across every ocean. In its parlors and libraries, Victorians speak confidently of progress, civilization, and empire, but inside a cramped office not far from the Thames, a clerk scratches his head at the same recurring problem. Someone has listed a profession as spirit wrangler. Another household insists that their daughter, age 9, is a milk telepath. One form is soaked in what smells suspiciously like gin. Another reads simply, to many people, try again later. This is not the empire in miniature. This is the empire in confusion, and it is the job of the enumeration clerks to make sense of it. The expanding scope of enumeration from its humble beginnings in 1801. The British census had ballooned by the mid-19th century into a monumental national undertaking. Each new census required more detail, more categories, more questions. The 1851 census had introduced specific occupational categories. By 1871, officials were demanding data on education, infirmities, employment status, and more. The 1891 census added questions on language, especially in Wales and Scotland, and whether people were deaf, dumb, imbecile, or lunatic, terms we now recognize as archaic or offensive, but which were then considered scientific classifications. This meant more paperwork, more errors, and more opportunities for confusion. To keep up, the clerical corps had to grow, and with it, the system of review and control. Asterisk inside the halls, the enumeration clerks no longer worked in scattered offices. By 1861, operations were centralized in government buildings like Somerset House or temporary halls rented for census years. Hundreds of desks stretched wall to wall. Lamps hung low from the ceiling, their smoke curling up to stain the rafters. A senior official might address the clerks at the start of a shift, reminding them to keep their script legible and uniform, not to allow political or personal opinions, to effect transcription, not to add or infer details not clearly written on the form. Still, discretion was sometimes unavoidable. If someone listed a job as seer of invisible wagons, a clerk had to choose, copy it verbatim, or code it as unemployed. What of the child marked which apprentice, or the husband whose occupation was disputing the rent? They learned to spot jokes, lies, and errors, but also became adept at reading between lines. Some common issues included illegible handwriting from enumerators in rural districts, dialect spellings Taylor instead of Taylor milk, instead of milk, duplicate names within large families, 5 Johns, all under 12, shorthand, HD for head of household, Dow for daughter, sometimes unreadable forms stained with grease, ink spills, tears, or simply missing sections. The process of cleaning the data was long and repetitive. It involved comparing forms, cross-checking household lists, and recopying entire schedules when needed. A clerk might spend a week transcribing just one London borough, only to start over after an audit uncovered a single repeated address. The dull innovations of the age, the work evolved with technology slowly. In the 1880s, the government began experimenting with standardized forms, printed more cleanly and with better ink. Clerks were trained in double-entry transcription, where 2 individuals recorded the same data independently to catch discrepancies. But most still worked with pen and ledger, seated in rows under dim lamps, elbow to elbow. Some innovations included indexing, slips, small tags that helped clerks reorder and file entries, occupation coding, where jobs were reduced to numbers, for example, 0234 Miller, 89 for domestic servant, marginal flagging, where uncertain entries were marked for supervisor review. Even with these systems, the pace was glacial. A well-trained clerk might transcribe 800 names per day, with larger cities producing over 500,000 entries. Errors were expected. Perfection was not, but consistency. That was everything. The quiet crisis of accuracy despite their best efforts. Enumeration clerks were constantly battling the limits of data collection. In rural Wales, entire forms arrived. Written in Welsh, few London clerks could translate them. In urban slums, tenement dwellers gave fake names to avoid landlords or taxes. In upper-class homes, butlers sometimes filled in the forms with embellished ages or falsified occupations to preserve appearances. One notorious case from the 1871 census involved an aristocrat's household listing 5 servants as family, friends, and the lady of the house's age as timeless. The clerk underlined the word timeless and scribbled a polite beside it. Elsewhere, more subtle tragedies occurred. A clerk might see a family of 7 with 3 listed as feeble-minded or crippled, but he would copy the terms without comment, then move on. There was no space for sympathy, only room for another line of ink. And so, the nation's pain, its illness, its disability, its loneliness, was recorded one cold number at a time. Clerks. At the margins, some clerks kept notebooks, though they were not supposed to. In these, they sometimes wrote brief, private observations. Too many children working. Is this really permitted? No address. Just behind the stables counted. Anyway, mother dead. Father listed as unknown man. Whole row of Irish names. All illiterate. Asked neighbor to help. These notes were not entered into the official record. They were, in effect, the humanity behind the statistics' silent testimonies, from men whose job was to observe but not speak. Their days blurred together. The tea went cold. The ink ran dry. But the pile of forms never ended. They were counting Britain, but they were also witnessing it. In its vast, contradictory sprawl, the human cost of bureaucracy, the clerks were underpaid. Their jobs were temporary. Their names were rarely attached to the ledgers they produced, and yet their work shaped everything from parliamentary boundaries to public health acts. The data they transcribed informed where schools were built, how hospitals were funded, and which areas were designated slums. They enabled the rise of modern government and became the first invisible layer of civil service bureaucracy that would define the 20th century, but they paid a price. Some suffered from chronic eye strain, others from cramped hands, poor posture, or lung ailments from the dust of old paper. A few wrote letters asking for more candles or better pens. Most were ignored. When the work ended, they were dismissed, sometimes thanked, rarely remembered. A slow-moving machine by the dawn of the 20th century. Enumeration had grown so large it began to outgrow even its clerks. Early tabulating machines were being trialed, precursors to computers. Punch cards replaced some forms. Data was turned into dots, but the principle remained the same. Real lives made legible by anonymous hands, and somewhere, in the quiet hours before dawn, a clerk turned another page, dipped his pen again, and copied the name of a coal miner's daughter who would one day become a grandmother someone might search for. They wouldn't know his name. They'd never thank him. But without him, she would not exist, at least, not in the record. Fade into the ledger's obscurity. Legacy, and the handwritten past the room is nearly empty now. The desks are stacked, the ink bottles corked, the ledgers bound and boxed. The final name has been copied, the last household transcribed. There are no cheers, no ceremony. A clerk closes his notebook, rubs the ink from his knuckles, and leaves the building quietly as he came. The census is done. No one will know his name, but his work, every line, every correction, every life counted will last longer than he ever could have imagined. The final handwritten censuses as the 20th century approached, the enumeration clerks found themselves at the end of an era. The 1901 census was one of the last to be fully transcribed by hand in the old method, ledger, pen, and meticulous repetition. Even then, changes were underway. The sheer scale of the data demanded mechanization in 1911. Punch card systems and holorith tabulators, an early form of mechanical computing, were introduced. These innovations drastically reduced the need for handwritten ledgers and individual transcribers. Where once 300 clerks might spend months hunched over pages, a team of 30 operators and a row of tabulators could process the same data in weeks. It was faster, cleaner, more efficient, but it was also colder. The small marks, the notations, the careful edits, the human hesitations and silent questions disappeared. The clerks were replaced by machines, not all at once, but inevitably, by the 1921 census. Their numbers had dwindled. The last generation of enumeration clerks, some of whom had begun as apprentices in 1871, left without fanfare. Ghosts in the records despite their anonymity. The legacy of the enumeration clerks lives on in ways you may not expect. Today, genealogists and historians rely on those original ledgers, now digitized and searchable online, to trace family histories. People across Britain and the Commonwealth discover great-grandparents, distant cousins, and long-lost branches of their family tree through entries painstakingly copied by men in Suit Street halls 150 years ago. Every misspelled surname, every faint ink blot, every peculiar note. Lodger deaf works night shift carries the mark of a real human hand. A clerk who squinted at a smudged form and did his best to capture a fleeting moment of a stranger's life. Sometimes, that's all that remains of a person. No headstone, no photograph, just a name, an age, an occupation. written in black ink on yellowed paper. A clerk's decision to mark widow, rather than leave it blank, might be the only surviving record of a marriage. A line through lunatic replaced with scholar might be the only evidence of mercy ever granted. They were not authors, but they were witnesses. Beyond Britain enumeration across the empires, the British Empire expanded. So too did the reach of the census. Clerks were employed not only in London but in Calcutta, Cape Town, Sydney and Kingston, in some colonies. Data collection was minimal or symbolical and riddled with gaps, mistranslations or assumptions, but clerks still processed what was sent. The challenge was immense, reconciling local dialects, non-Western naming customs, and unfamiliar household structures with rigid bureaucratic categories. A Nigerian village might be recorded as a single dwelling, a Maori family listed under anglicized first names only, an Indian caste noted as unknown tribe, and the clerks British and colonial alike did their best. However flawed, what they created was a mirror of empire, an uneven, imperfect, but massive attempt to record the lives of millions. And though many of those records were flawed, they remained some of the only surviving documents from entire regions and communities. The vanishing individual. As the 20th century unfolded, enumeration continued, but the role of the clerk diminished. Machines grew smarter, forms became cleaner. Eventually, data was gathered via typewriters, then computers, and finally online submissions. No more ink, no more ledgers, but something was lost in that progressive slowness, a gravity, the sense that each name had to be touched, considered, and physically written, that a person's existence was held in the hand of another, even for just a moment. And those who did that holding, they vanished. No statues exist for enumeration clerks, no portraits, no poems, only the census ledgers themselves, millions of names, written by hands that never wrote their own. A reflection on silence. There is something quietly beautiful about the work of enumeration, not just its ambition but its humility. It does not aim to immortalize heroes or record battles. It captures the ordinary. Farmers, weavers, servants, machinists, clerks, widows, children. It tells us who was alive on a Tuesday in April, what they did for work, and where they laid their heads at night. It is history without drama, just lives. And the clerks who transcribed it, line by line, gave us that gift. They preserved the ordinary. In doing so, made it extraordinary. Perhaps the last question to ask is this: when future generations look back at our own data or digital records, our cloud-stored lives, will anyone remember who recorded us? Will there be a modern clerk, unseen but careful, making sure the commas are in the right place and the birth year is correct? Or have we already said goodbye to that role, to that quiet figure by the lamp, dipping a pen and turning lives into lines? A floating world, work, family, and for miles per hour you hear the scrape of the tiller, the slap of a wet rope on iron cleat, the hollow knock of boots on wooden planks. The canal is barely wider than the boat itself, and the water flat and brown stretches only as far as the next winding bend. Trees lean in from the banks, ducks scatter, a heron lifts off slowly, as if in no hurry to go anywhere fast. The boat moves at walking pace just under 4 miles per hour and yet carries tons of cargo, a family of 5, a coal stove, a lace-curtained window, and the cumulative memory of a quiet, moving way of life. This is the world of the canal men and women, the boat people of Britain's inland waterways, whose trade, toil, and tenacity quietly fueled the industrial age. They were never in the history books, but for 100 years they moved Britain's goods, raised children on water, and created a unique, isolated culture all from the back of the 70s. NARROWBOAT. The rise of the canal system. Before the canal boats came the roads rutted, muddy and slow, then the rivers fickle and prone to flooding. But by the late 1700s, as Britain's industries exploded, entrepreneurs and engineers began digging something new, man-made waterways. Between 1760 and 1830, over 4,000 miles of canals were carved into the countryside, linking mines to factories, factories to ports, and towns to one another. Known as the Canal Mania, this boom allowed heavy goods like coal, timber, limestone, bricks, beer, grain, and textiles to move more efficiently than ever before. To move those goods, companies built long, narrow wooden boats, just 7 feet wide, the width of a single canal lock, and up to 70 feet long. They were pulled by horses, led by ropes along the towpath beside the canal. Each boat had a crew, sometimes hired men, but increasingly families, husband, wife, children, lived aboard permanently. They became a floating underclass, always present, rarely noticed. A life between topers. Living aboard a narrowboat meant compression. Space was precious. The living quarters, called the cabin, measured just 10 to 12 feet long. Within that space, an entire family slept, cooked, cleaned, and kept warm. The boatman's wife tended a coal-fired stove, made tea, and often kept a tiny home spotless, despite the soot and cargo dust. Embroidered lace curtains, polished brass, and painted furniture were common small acts of pride in an otherwise grueling life. Children were born on the boats, learned to crawl on deck, and were taught early to jump locks, handle ropes, and steer. Many never went to school, For the canal families, there was no fixed address, no church, no parish records, no formal schooling. They were always passing through, and because of that, they were viewed by land dwellers as something between gypsies and ghosts. Were not leisure 2 days canals are associated with leisure the slow holiday cruise, the waterside pub, the painted cap. But in the 19th century, canal boats were industrial engines. They hauled 25 to 30 tons of cargo per load, and the schedule was unrelenting. A family boat might load coal in Birmingham, travel 2 days south to Oxford, unload, reload with grain, continue to London. Then return with manufactured goods. Boats ran day and night. Men often steered by moonlight, and women took turns leading the horse along the towpath, lantern swinging from her arm. Children ran ahead to open the lock gates sometimes. Operating 10 or more locks per day, work was paid per ton, per mile. Rest was lost income. Delay meant loss of cargo space at the next dock. And when the canals froze in winter, boats were trapped. No work, no money, sometimes no food. A diary entry from 1887 records: 6 days iced in at Stoke Bruern, coal gone, horse lame, boys hungry and still. The family waited. The water would thaw. The trade would resume. Always slowly, always forward. The boat horse in the roamer's rhythm central to canal life was the boat horse, a powerful, steady creature, usually a shire or cob, trained to walk calmly along the towpath for hours without spooking or stopping. The horse was family, children slept beside it, women brushed it, men doctored it with vinegar or beer when it was lame. A boat without a horse was a home without legs. Some families named their horses like people of grand names, like Sultan, Duchess, or Napoleon. Superstition surrounded the animals. A sick horse was a bad omen. A dead one could mean ruin. The rhythm of canal life was tied to the pace of the horse, the gurgle of the water, and the distance between locks. This rhythm shaped everything. When meals were taken, when babies were born, when songs were sung, the canal people, we didn't follow clocks. They followed the water. A culture apart over time. The canal families developed their own customs, dialects, and symbols. Boats were decorated with roses and castles, a distinctive folk art tradition painted in bright reds, greens, and yellows. They wore shawls and bonnets, even while hauling ropes or unloading cargo. Children were raised to respect boat manners, rules about politeness, work ethic, and cleanliness. Boats had names like the Pride of Burslem, Mabel, and Rose, or Faithful Jack painted carefully on the stern in swirling script, but they were not romanticized by others. Land dwellers viewed them with suspicion. Authorities accused them of neglecting children, avoiding taxes, or spreading disease. They were rarely welcomed in towns unless delivering cargo. One town ordinance from 1894 banned canal families from lingering near the green. In truth, canal people kept to themselves, not by choice, but by necessity. They worked too much to socialize. They moved too often to settle. They were always in motion, but always the same dot lives on the edge of maps. Census takers often skipped. The boats. Schools refused canal children. Births and deaths went unregistered. In many ways, canal families barely existed on paper, and yet they kept Britain's industry supplied. They moved bricks to London, coal to factories, wool to mills, and barley to breweries. They were invisible engines of progressing on planks, eating beside horses, and drifting through fog at dawn. And as trains began to rise and roads expanded, their slow, steady world would soon begin to disappear, but not yet. First, there would be resistance, there would be pride, and there would be a long, slow decline, because before they vanished, the canal men would leave behind a memory of something slower, quieter, and deeply human, a way of life shaped not by speed or power, but by the narrow winding of a country, at work. But what would become of them when steel replaced tollens, when children left the boats, when trade stopped following the canals? What happens to a world built at 4 miles an hour in a century that suddenly moves at 60? The iron competition, railways, resistance, and the long slow decline. A low whistle cuts across the frosted fields. A black steam engine snakes along the ridge. It's faster than any boat hand. It carries more cargo in 1 hour than a whole fleet of narrowboats can haul in a week. The canal boatman watches it from his tiller. He doesn't say much. He rarely does. But he knows that train is not just going somewhere. It is leaving him behind. The age of iron and speed by the 1830s. Railways were already beginning to creep across the British countryside. By the 1850s, they were a nationwide network. And by 1900, they had fundamentally reshaped commerce, communication, and speed itself. Trains could travel 10 times faster than a horse-drawn canal boat, operate on fixed schedules, immune to frozen canals or flood-prone locks. Carry far more cargo per journey, connect industrial centers to ports directly, cutting out the middlemen in the canal system. Once the pride of British engineering was suddenly too slow, too narrow, and too inflexible. And yet, the canal men didn't give up. They adapted, resisted, and survived sometimes for decades longer than anyone predicted. Holding the line, the fight for canal freighting response to railway dominance. Canal companies and boatmen fought back in modest often ingenious ways. Night boating became common. Crews worked through the dark to shave time from delivery schedules. Some boats used steam or diesel engines, though these were expensive and often unreliable. Canal carriers focused on specialized goods that trains couldn't yet handle well, like fragile pottery, chemicals, or coal for short distances. The use of flyboats, unmanned craft, towed in tanks maximized haul capacity. Boatme also developed informal alliances with merchants, offering lower prices than the railways for certain local routes. They took pride in their reliability, even if it meant sleeping in shifts and working through snow. As late as 1900, thousands of working boats still crisscrossed England's canals, particularly in the industrial Midlands and northern towns. Canals remained vital in cities like Birmingham, Stoke-on-Trent and Manchester, but it was a war of attrition and the trains kept winning. Children of the water. The decline of canal freight also meant the decline of the canal family. In earlier decades, it had made economic sense for families to live aboard. Wives and children provided unpaid labor, helping with locks, tending horses, cooking, and loading cargo. But by the early 20th century, with shrinking profits and increasing scrutiny from social reformers, families were seen as a liability.